All set? All right. Hello. Welcome. It's Thursday, June 27th. Welcome to the Litchfield Budget Committee, which I'll call to order at 7 o'clock. So please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. So actually, one thing that we'll note that once after the meeting, after the workshop, we're going to actually have some meeting topics to discuss. And we will put the teacher's contract, which is currently towards the end, towards the beginning, because we expect that we'll have some people here that will wish to speak to that. But until that point, I'm going to turn the meeting over to the NHMA through Brent Lemire.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the boards that are present. I have the pleasure, and thanks to Madam Chair, of introducing the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Municipal Association. And the reason is that she is a colleague of mine. I serve on the board, and I was the chair of the board when we were lucky enough to be able to appoint Margaret as Executive Director. And I told her and others, that it was one of the best votes that I've taken. She's been a breath of fresh air. She's doing remarkable things with the Municipal Association. And I'm proud that Litchfield is able to avail themselves of her talents. And I will let you, Margaret, introduce Nate. And thank you all for having Margaret and Nate down. And I think you'll all enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Brent, and thank you for having us tonight. I know that the presentation says that it's presented by Margaret Burns, but of course I have with me Nate Grays, our Municipal Services Counsel, who's been with us for a few months, and we're both going to speak to different parts of the presentation tonight. So basically what we have for you is an overview of budget law, and that's really what we're going to be talking about, including the Budget Committee's roles and responsibilities with regard to the budget. You should all have a packet that includes a copy of the PowerPoint presentation if you want to follow along, if you want to write some notes, or maybe you just want to listen. Our presentations are usually content-wise, are usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on the questions that we get. And we are happy to take questions throughout the evening. I would just ask that, you keep the questions general in nature. If they're much more specific in nature, much more detailed scenarios, they're better answered one-on-one rather than in the presentation. But if you need a point of clarification, or we say something and it leads to some other questions about some other laws, that sort of thing, just feel free to pop in and ask the question. Some of you may also know that we have this publication, Basic Law of Budgeting, for those of you who have attended our Budget and Finance Conference in September. That's a full day on budget law. So if this is not enough time spent on budget law and you'd like to hear more, you can come to a full day presentation in September. So we're very excited to be here. Thank you for having us in Litchfield, and thank you for Litchfield's membership in NHMA. This is one of the things that we do for our members: trainings, workshops, legal advice, as well as legislative work. So I'm just going to jump right in, and we're going to start with some very basics and then go into a little more detail. So basically, when we think about budget law and we think about municipalities and budgeting, there are a number of different statutes that come into play. And I don't know how many of you, are any of you like really new to being on the budget committee, or yes? And are you really new to municipal world in general, or have you served on other boards in the past? New. Okay. So one of the things that can happen when we start giving these presentations and talking about RSAs is people look at us and say, what are you talking about? What is an RSA? What are these sections? So the New Hampshire laws are referred to as the revised statutes annotated. So when we say RSA this and RSA that, all we're talking about is the provision of state law that is relevant. So when it comes to budget law, there are several sections. Chapter 31 is your chapter in the New Hampshire statutes that talks basically about the powers and duties of towns. So that we'll see is relevant to budget law. Chapter 39 is the town meeting chapter, which of course is where budget adoption happens. So it's relevant to budget law as well. 21J really is only on here to be mindful of the fact that that's where all those DRA deadlines and requirements are found in RSA chapter 21-J. The big chapter, obviously, is Chapter 32, Municipal Budget Law, and that's where we will spend most of our time tonight looking at the different sections of RSA Chapter 32. But of course, Chapter 33 is relevant. That is your bond chapter, so that's all about long-term debt, issuing bonds, going into debt for big projects like a new public safety building, things like that. And RSA Chapter 35 is the separate chapter on capital reserve funds. So they have their own separate chapter in state law that governs the creation and the use and the discontinuance and everything in between that comes with capital reserve funds. So the last sort of point we put up here on the PowerPoint is no home rule. And for those of you who have been to, I see nodding heads, for those of you who have been to presentations before, you're like, yes, Margaret, we know. But for those of you who haven't been to presentations before, this is a really important starting point no matter what we're talking about. We're talking about budget law, we're talking about road law, we're talking about the right to know law, whatever it is, ordinances and municipalities. It's always relevant to start with the fact that New Hampshire is not a home rule state. And what does that mean for you all? And what does that mean for us? It means that as municipalities and as municipal officials, we have to know that municipalities only have the authority to do something if the state has said we have the authority to do something. And the state gives us authority to do things almost always via state law, so via the RSAs. And the reason that's important is because sometimes, or if you're from a different state that does have home rule, right? If you originated in a state with home rule, you think, well, municipalities, towns and cities have the authority to do something unless there's some law that says you can't do it. And it's the exact opposite in New Hampshire, right? So we're always saying, okay, if we as a municipality want to do X thing or pass a certain ordinance, we have to first ask ourselves whether there's a state law that allows us to do that. And the most classic example of that, the easiest just for us all to sort of conceptualize, is zoning. So almost all municipalities in New Hampshire have zoning ordinances. The only reason we're allowed to have zoning ordinances is because there's a state law that gives us the authority to have zoning ordinances, and it sets out all the different parameters that municipalities are allowed to and not allowed to regulate in zoning ordinances. The reason that the home rule is relevant to municipal law is when we think about what can we spend money on, what can we budget for, what are municipalities allowed to spend money on or appropriate money on or get long-term debt and bonds to spend money on. We have to, in the first instance, have the authority to do the thing that we want to spend the money on, right? So that's why home rule or not having home rule is also relevant to budget law, because if we have the authority to do it, we inherently have the authority to spend money on it and to appropriate money on it. So that's just sort of a little starting point as we go into the specific requirements of municipal budget law. The second slide is one that we just want to get out of the way right now so we don't even have to think about it later on. And this is sort of, well, what happens if we violate budget law? So we're going to spend most of the evening talking about what the laws are, but what would happen if we didn't follow budget law, we missed something, or there was an intentional violation of budget law? It is possible under this section of the municipal budget law, RSA 32, section 12, for a municipal official who violates budget law to actually be removed from office, right? And that would happen through a petition to the relevant superior court for removal from office. And there would have to be some actual violation of budget law that occurred in order to justify removal. This is important because under New Hampshire law, most appointed and elected officials, they can't just be removed from office, right? Once you're elected in for a term or you're appointed in for a term by the appointing authority, you're in for that term, unless there's some specific statute that says that this person or these people can be removed for a specific reason under specific circumstances. So this is one of those very few specific circumstances where if there were a violation of municipal budget law, it would actually create a possibility for removal from office. And this case that you see up there, that's a New Hampshire Supreme Court case, Blake versus Pittsfield. And the only reason we throw that up there is because there has been at least once in New Hampshire history, at least that made it its way to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, a case where a municipal official was actually removed from office for violating budget law. And under that circumstance, he was a department head who overspent his budget after being told that he was going to overspend his budget and he needed to stop getting close to overspending his budget and then overspent his budget. So there is at least one time in history where this removal provision was used. That is pretty infrequent. And frankly, the most common consequence that is likely to occur to a town for violating budget law is that the Department of Revenue, the DRA, can disallow money that was appropriated if it didn't follow the requirements of the municipal budget law. And what I mean by that is that the Department of Revenue, every year after you have your town meeting and the voters vote on all of the separate warrant articles, whether you're traditional or SB2 like Litchfield is, after that happens, after all the votes come in, your regional auditor or advisor, whoever is responsible for your area, has to review your ballot, your warrant, and determine whether all of the different things that were appropriated, all of the different amounts of money that were appropriated, whether they were done correctly. And if they weren't, they can just be like crossed out, disallowed. You know, you thought you did this right and you thought you got the money for this project, but it didn't follow budget law. And so it's disallowed. That is possible. So that's really the biggest consequence, is the worry of DRA disallowing a particular appropriation. But as long as you follow the steps in statute, whether it's, you know, the procedural requirements prior to town meeting, whether it's the procedural requirements for getting a bond, holding a hearing, you know, giving the proper notice, whether it's just following Chapter 35 on how you form a capital reserve fund or put money in a capital reserve fund, as long as you follow those steps, you're not going to have that issue. But that's the biggest consequence, and that's what you want to be aware of, is that theoretically, or even more than theoretically, that can happen, where if there's an incorrect piece in the step in the process, there can be DRA disallowance of an appropriation of money. So putting that aside and moving on now to the actual budget law, let's start by talking about sort of who the people are, who the players are who are involved in putting together the budget, getting the budget to the voters, and then ultimately getting a budget adopted and even spending the budget once you have a budget that's adopted. So we have up on the screen, we have the legislative body, the governing body, and the official budget committee. And not every town actually has an official budget committee, but Litchfield does. So we're going to talk about it in the context of a town having an official budget committee. So the legislative body, that's just your voters, right? So when you read a statute and you see that the legislative body has to vote on something or has to do something, they're just talking about the voters via town meeting. And the role of the legislative body in the budget process is that the legislative body ultimately adopts the budget, right? Or doesn't adopt the budget and leaves us with a default budget, right? Which is also something we're going to talk about tonight. But that's their role. Their role is to, you know, get that budget through the town meeting process and then to vote to adopt the budget or not adopt the budget. They also have power and authority with regard to making amendments, whether it's to the operating budget itself or to other warrant articles that contain money, that are budgetary warrant articles as well. So they're ultimately the ones who say yes or no, or let's amend it, and then we'll say yes. They have that legislative authority. The governing body has the authority really to do two things. One is that the governing body usually first compiles a proposed draft budget for the budget committee to consider. So they usually take that first responsibility for putting together a proposed budget, which then goes to the official budget committee to do what it does with the budget. The second thing that the governing body does, which is a huge thing, is the governing body, which is the select board for most towns, they're the ones who get the budget and spend the budget. So once the voters say yes or no, or they adopt the budget and they adopt other appropriations, it is the governing body's authority to make spending decisions with the money that's been appropriated. So that's really their realm. They're the spenders. And we're going to talk about, what they can do with transfer authority and other things, and what the restrictions are on spending money throughout the year. The official budget committee's role is on the next slide. And this is all laid out in major part. The official budget committee's role is laid out in various different statutes, but it's laid out primarily in 32 section 16 and 17. The section that governs the creation of an official budget committee is 32 section 15. But the budget committee's role is really to be this sort of separate and independent committee in the town that has the responsibility for putting together a responsible budget and a budget that actually meets the needs of the municipality. So when an official budget committee is created, what is actually happening is a little bit of the select board's responsibility is being delegated away from the select board to a separate committee. Because if you don't have an official budget committee, the budgeting responsibilities all fall on the governing body. They all fall on the select board. But in towns that have an official budget committee, at some point in the past, the voters voted to create an official budget committee and to essentially vest that responsibility for the budgeting process and the creation of a proposed budget in that separate committee. And as an official budget committee, you have statutory duties. So RSA Chapter 32 gives you specific responsibilities and duties with regard to the budget that you're required to follow and that are yours to follow. So what does the budget committee do? Well, one thing that the budget committee does is reviews expenditures throughout the year. And I think most budget committees are aware of this. Sometimes we think, oh, the budget committee, it starts its responsibilities when it's, time to put together a budget. And then once the budget goes to the voters, they're done until the next time that they have to think about the budget. But part of being ready and educated enough to do the budget for next year is having some kind of quarterly review of expenditures throughout the year to understand whether what you've budgeted or what you propose to the voters as the budget, whether it's actually meeting the needs of the municipality. So reviewing expenditures is a really important part of the budget committee's responsibility. But as you'll see sort of a few points down, and I did bold it, and I didn't do this to, be condescending in any way or anything like that, is that the budget committee does not control spending. So you think about it as a division of duties, right? The budget committee compiles a budget and proposes it to the voters, and the select board is the one who spends it at the end of the day once the budget is appropriated in whatever form it is. So while the review of expenditures is part of your job, telling the select board or whoever it is how to spend the budget is not part of your job. But it may be relevant when you go to do the budget for the following year, how things were being spent and whether they met the needs of the municipality. Yes, a question.
But we can act as an advisory capacity, right? If we see something that's out of hand in the current year's expenditures, right? And go to the board and at least advise them of what we're seeing and ask questions and engage.
I'm not going to tell you can't do that. I will say that that's not listed in the statutory responsibilities of a budget committee. So it's not expressly a duty that you have. And it's, I suppose, not something that they have to let you advise them on. But if there's a working relationship between the two different boards, that can be sort of an internal practice or an internal policy. I wouldn't say that that violates anything. But that, that can be a tricky thing is, here we are reviewing the expenditures. Here we are trying to, create this budget and we think this is good and we have a difference of opinion. But just, really keep in mind that your job is that you're trying to put together the most prudent budget that you can. But remember that ultimately at the end of the day, it's the only people who get to say whether that's the budget or not are the voters. And once they've said yes or no, or whatever they've appropriated, it then essentially goes into the hands of the governing body to be spent with rules and restrictions about spending. So when it comes to sort of that time where we're getting to, yes, it's time to think about putting together next year's budget or the upcoming year's budget, the Budget Committee has a responsibility for reviewing the proposed budget of the Select Board, and also reviewing proposals and requesting information from the various departments in order to compile the Budget Committee's budget. What is the budget that's going to go to the voters from the Budget Committee? And the statutes do not only say that the Budget Committee is to review the proposals and the information, but they do say that municipal officials are supposed to provide information requested by the Budget Committee that's necessary for the budgeting process. And sometimes that can even be tricky because the Budget Committee wants certain information to assist it in understanding departmental needs or backup information to understand why a department is requesting a certain amount of information, a certain budget that's very different from last year or different from what the Budget Committee thinks it should be. And while the Budget Committee does have the authority to request information, just keep in mind two things. One is that the information needs to be relevant to the budget that the Budget Committee puts together, right? It really needs to be something that you need in order to compile the budget and that department's budget in your proposed budget. The other thing that's important is that the Budget Committee doesn't supervise town employees or town departments. And so you may need information, and what the best case scenario is that you work through the town administrator or whoever, the department head, whoever it is, to make sure that, you're making the request, but you're being mindful of the fact that particularly large requests might take time, right? And so if you have a Budget Committee meeting tomorrow night and you demand that an employee provide you hundreds of pages of documents, but he's got other things to do, right? That's going to create an internal conflict. So I'm not even looking behind me. This is just an important thing to keep in mind is that, that interplay, you have an important role and the town employees are important in getting you the information, but they have 100,000 other things to do as well. So working with the town administrator to say, let's set up some deadlines and protocols so that we know ahead of time when we're going to be requesting particular information and giving that kind of lead time, or maybe everything goes through the town administrator, whatever the internal policy is of the town to follow is really helpful in not creating that kind of conflict and making your jobs even harder than it already is. So obviously the big job of the Budget Committee is to actually prepare the budget. So you get all the information, you review the proposals, you've been reviewing expenditures throughout the year, and then ultimately you are preparing the budget that goes to the voters. So that posted official budget that goes to the voters to decide on and consider, that is your budget that goes to them at town meeting. You also are responsible for scheduling and holding the budget hearings. So I'm sure you know that you are required to have at least one hearing on the budget prior to finalizing the budget. You're required at the first budget hearing, if there's only one, then at the budget hearing, but if there are multiples, at the first budget hearing, you're required to disclose the default budget at that first hearing. And that one of the really important things about the budget hearing or hearings is that all purposes and amounts of appropriations contained in the operating budget or contained in other warrant articles must be disclosed or discussed at the budget hearing. So if you have just one budget hearing, there's nothing wrong with that if you end up just having one public budget hearing, but just make sure that at that one budget hearing, you've disclosed the default budget, you've disclosed and discussed the operating budget, and you've disclosed or discussed all the other warrant articles that contain money, basically that ask the voters to appropriate money for other purposes. And if after the first budget hearing, you realize as a committee that you're going to increase any of those amounts, or you get in other warrant articles containing money or a petitioned warrant article containing money, you're required to hold at least one more budget hearing. The idea here is that before that posted budget goes to the voters, there's been at least one hearing where they've had the opportunity to hear about that proposed spending, that proposed appropriation. And it's a pretty loose standard in the sense that, again, it has to be disclosed or discussed. It doesn't even have to be like nailed down at the budget hearing. Just as long as you don't add something new after that budget hearing or increase an amount that you talked about at the budget hearing, then you've done your job making sure that the public is aware of all the purposes and amounts of appropriation. So that's a really big one, and that's one to be aware of. And then, of course, also with the default budget being disclosed at that first budget hearing. You have the responsibility to finalize that proposed budget and to forward it to the governing body so that it can be posted with the warrant in accordance with the deadlines. And finally, in towns that have an official budget committee, you are subject to the so-called 10% rule, which most of you are probably pretty familiar with. This rule basically says that the voters can't they can't authorize the expenditure of funds in an amount that is more than 10% more than the budget committee's total recommended appropriations. So we're going to talk about recommendations on warrant articles in a minute, but basically the way this works is the budget committee has a recommended operating budget, and then it puts its recommendation or non-recommendation on all of those other warrant articles that contain money. And at the end of the day, you total up all of that together, all of those recommended appropriations, and the voters can't amend amounts so much that they go over the 10% more than the total. And sometimes I joke and say, I don't know how often it's a problem that the voters are adding so much money to the budget that they're going over the 10%. And usually I get asked, well, does that also apply to reducing appropriations 10%? No, it only applies to going above, right? And the idea here is that you are supposed to be in a position to make a wise recommendation of what is a good budget and what are good other spending decisions on the part of the municipality. And so when the voters create you as the budget committee and give you that responsibility, they can only sort of go so high above what has been recommended by the budget committee. So that's a restriction that exists in an official budget committee town that does not also exist in towns without official budget committees. Yeah.
Just a quick question, if I may. That is excluding anything to do with the school.
There are some exclusions from the total amount that you add up to get the total amount recommended by the budget committee for the purpose of the 10% rule. I am talking about, I'm talking from the perspective of the town budget and what are the appropriations, but whether it can apply on the school side or not, I just wouldn't comment on that because I don't know exactly how that's structured. Good question, though. Thank you. So whose budget is it? We've kind of already touched upon this a little bit. Whose budget is it? We often say, well, it's the official budget committee's budget because you're the ones who say, here's the budget, here's what's going to the voters, here's what we put together. But of course, at the end of the day, it's for the voters to vote on, it's for the voters to amend, and it's for the voters to adopt. Keep in mind, too, and we'll see this as we talk more about, the governing body's authority to spend and transfer authority and things of that nature. Keep in mind that the budget is not this like stuck in the mud document, right? It's a plan for spending. It's a set of sort of policy decisions and authorizations that you, as in governing body, we authorize you to spend money for the following things throughout the year. And the budget itself breaks down amounts to be spent on those purposes, but they're not static. There's the ability to spend more or less on different things with some restrictions, but generally it's sort of a plan. It's definitely not a static document. It's not, if this department has $1 million, not only they have to spend that exact amount, and there's no more that can be given and no less. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well. There's a case up here referenced on the last bullet point, the Brentwood School District versus the Brentwood Budget Committee case. And this was an interesting scenario that we sort of like to bring up to talk about, how clear, how specific does the Budget Committee have to be when it makes changes to the governing body's proposed budget or to, changes from last year's budget. So in this case, essentially what the Budget Committee did was, when it got that proposed budget from the governing body, they looked at it and they wanted to make cuts. They wanted to reduce the budget. And rather than sort of going through the different line items or the different departments and making alterations to that, they instead sort of did general high-level cuts. Like, we're going to cut $650,000 from general programs, and we're going to cut $300,000 from special programs. And they just sort of made kind of big cuts off the top without specifying where those cuts were coming from. And, to some extent that makes sense, because operating budgets are bottom line budgets. They're made up of different line items, but at the end of the day, they're a big pot of money. But in this circumstance, there was an allegation, and the reason that we have a court case out of it, there was an allegation that they had not done their duty by making those cuts and making it unclear, once the budget was adopted, making it unclear what was meant to be where, what was the allocation, what was the plan for spending based on the way that those cuts were made. And this was not sort of a great exercise of Budget Committee duties, but in this circumstance, the judge did find that they had not violated their duties and responsibilities. So it's just sort of something to keep in mind. It certainly created controversy there in that community, not something that we strive to do as a budget committee. But, being sort of specific and articulating what you're doing, the changes that you're making, using that public budget hearing process to talk about what the changes are, is really helpful to preventing a scenario like this. There was a separate case, a separate scenario where, and I don't remember how long ago it was or what town it was, a separate scenario where a budget committee just took sort of the proposed governing body budget and just did a cut off the top, just cut just enough so that if the voters increase the budget at town meeting, they could never, because of the 10% rule, they could never bring it back up to where it was, the originally proposed budget, right? So they sort of cut out that ability of the voters to bring it back up. And that was an interesting case, because the judge in that case said that that action had so-called neutered the voters, right? It had intentionally taken away some choice on the part of the voters. So those are interesting cases to help you think about, sort of as you work through the budget, clarity and your duties and responsibilities with regard to the budget. Okay. So we have in our book, the way that we sort of break down basic law of budgeting is we break it down in a number of key principles of budget law. And one of them, one really important key principle, is that you have to have an appropriation before you can spend any money. So before we even get to the point where we're spending money, there has to be an appropriation. And an appropriation is a legal term, and it has a very specific meaning under municipal budget law. And it's found in this section, RSA chapter 32(8). And so when we say that you have to have an appropriation is essentially a purpose for spending money. And it is an action by the voters to authorize the the spending of money for a particular purpose. So you'll hear appropriation used as a noun. This is an appropriation. It's a purpose for spending money. And you'll also hear it used as a verb. The voters have to appropriate the money. They have to authorize the expenditure of money through the legislative process. And the purposes for which you can appropriate money, the things that are valid appropriations, are things for which towns are allowed to spend money, right? So we talked about, no home rule. You have authority to spend money if you have authority to do the thing that you want to spend money on. And these sections here, 32.3, as well as 31.4, sort of touch upon that you have to have a valid purpose, and that a valid purpose is anything that a municipality is allowed to spend money on. And apparently back in the day, 31 section 4 used to have a long list of things you were allowed to spend money on. And it was never quite up to date, right? There were always things missing from the list. So it became sort of a very general, very short statute that just says, you can spend money for a public purpose, and it's impliedly, if you can do the thing, you can spend money on that particular thing. So in some senses, it's a helpful statute. In other sense, do the function, you can spend the money on it, and you can appropriate money for that purpose. And these two sections here, we have village districts listed, 52 section 1. That's just the statute that authorizes village districts to exist for certain reasons. And the statute says that village districts, like towns, they can spend money relative to any purpose for which they're formed. So if they're a village district formed for the purpose of providing fire service, then they have all the authority to appropriate money for fire service, but that's all. They apply to that particular thing. And school districts have their own separate section about what their authority is, what they can spend money on. 198 section 4. I have to say it's pretty brief, and it's a pretty old statute that really doesn't get into the details of what school districts do, but there it is. That is the section that allows it. So we're always starting with, we have to have an appropriation in order to spend money. We can only appropriate money for public purposes, for things we're allowed to spend money on, and it is the legislative body who gets to authorize and make appropriations. As it says here too on the screen, it says that before you can spend money, you must both raise and appropriate money for that purpose. So it's not just the authorization by the voters, it's also the raising of the money to be spent. And that's why in your warrant articles, they start with, for the most part, to see if the town will vote to raise and appropriate, blah, 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 blah. And those words, they may seem archaic, but they do, in fact, still have specific legal meaning. So they have to authorize the expenditure of money for a particular purpose, and they also have to raise it. And what raising money means is that there has to be a specific place, a specific source from which the money is coming. So the general rule, if there's no source specified, is that money is being raised through general taxation, right? So it's the general way that money comes at the local level. But if you are raising and appropriating money for a project, and you're going to do some through taxation, and some of it's coming from a grant, and some of it's coming out of a capital reserve fund, you actually have to, and when I say you, I mean the voters, when they vote, they have to approve all of those different sources of funds. They're raising money. They're raising some from taxation, they're raising some from a grant, and they're raising some from a capital reserve fund, so that it's clear that we're appropriating X amount of dollars for this purpose, and it's coming from these different sources of funds. And that is sort of one of those basic requirements that when DRA is looking at your warrant, hopefully before your warrant is finalized, when they're doing that pre-town meeting warrant review, that's what they're looking for, that all of those things are lined up, that you have specified the amount of money as well as the sources that the money is being raised from. So And when we talk about sort of where money comes from or how money is raised and appropriated, I know in my mind, I sort of separate out operating budget. That's our bottom line budget that contains our general operating expenses for the year. And then on the other hand, we have all of these other warrant articles on the warrant, many of which contain requests essentially for money for other spending purposes. So we have this operating budget, and then maybe we have these other projects or other spending purposes that are separately lined up in separate warrant articles. But they are all, whether it's the operating budget or other warrant articles containing money, they are all doing just that. They are raising and appropriating money to be spent for a particular purpose. And as we've said, both the operating budget and all of those other warrant articles containing money are part of your public budget hearing process that the budget committee puts on. The appropriations, again, the purposes for spending, they are legislative body acts, and they create so-called guiding principles for spending. So if the voters approve a warrant article to do a road paving project on a particular road, it contains X amount of dollars to do that project. Basically, what they've said is, yes, we authorize the expenditure of funds on that particular project. What it doesn't mean is, yes, you must spend money or spend those particular funds on that particular project, right? They're guiding principles, they're authorizations to act and authorizations to spend money for that purpose. And they're authorizations to the governing body to spend money on that particular purpose. So similar to the way the operating budget is a plan for spending, appropriations are, guiding principles for projects and spending money throughout the budget year. So if the basic rule is you have to have an appropriation, the voters have to raise and appropriate money for a particular purpose. And if you don't have that, then you can't spend money. If that's the general rule, then we have to keep in mind that, there have to be 100 exceptions to that particular rule. And fortunately, I don't think we have 100, but we do have a number of important exceptions to the rule, no spending without an appropriation first. One of the big exceptions to that rule is the transfer authority, the authority of the select board or whoever it is in the municipality who has the authority to spend the budget, to move money around within the budget to spend more or less than what was budgeted for on a particular purpose. And we'll talk about that a little later on in the presentation. Legal judgments. So if the town is sued, if there is a legal judgment, the town can say, oh, well, we didn't budget for this legal judgment and the voters didn't approve spending money on this, so we can't pay the legal judgment. That is not correct. Legal judgments, they kind of trump the no spending without an appropriation, and those are legally binding, even though you may not have budgeted to spend money on that particular purpose. The Department of Revenue can give a municipality permission to spend where they sort of maybe mess something up. They didn't budget for something, they didn't plan for something properly, and they need authority to spend money where they didn't get that voter approval. They didn't have that appropriation. And that's through basically a petition process to the Department of Revenue that they're allowed to approve. Spending prior to town meeting is another exception to the no spending without an appropriation. And this is such an odd thing when you think about it, because for most of us, except for our school folks, the towns are on a, January 1 is when the budget year starts. But of course, in New Hampshire, we have our town meeting when the budget actually gets approved in March for most of us and in April and May for the rest of the towns. And so you actually have this lag time from January 1 to when you get your budget that started on January 1 that you didn't have until the second Tuesday in March. So this is very interesting because technically that period of time between January and town meeting, you don't have your budget yet. And what this section of the law says is that towns are allowed to spend money consistent with the same spending for the same purposes as they did last year at this time of year. So it's sort of a status quo spending time in between the beginning of the year and the adoption of the budget. Okay, so that's more of a issue for the governing body, but it's important for you to know too that there is this lag time, this sort of status quo period where there's a spending that's happening, but there's technically no budget yet. And that's just a very sort of interesting nuance of municipal budget law, if you find that kind of thing interesting, right? So other things that you're allowed to spend money on without an appropriation. Many towns have given the select board the authority to accept and expend unanticipated revenue. So that's usually the form of grants. So you may have it here in Litchfield. Many towns have it where the select board doesn't have to go to town meeting to accept grant money. They can just accept it at a public meeting or a public hearing, and then they can spend it for the purpose for which the grant was given. Capital reserve funds and trust funds. If you have a capital reserve fund and the selectmen are appointed as agents to expend, if you have a trust fund and the selectmen are appointed as agents to expend, they can spend money from that fund consistent with the purpose of the fund anytime throughout the year. You don't need to get voter approval to spend money from those types of funds. And there are other types of funds like that as well. For example, the Conservation Commission has its own non-lapsing fund that lives on from year to year that they're allowed to spend money on without going back to town meeting. There's also, certain multi-year appropriations. I think the easiest example we can all think of is, collective bargaining agreements with cost items. Those are approved once at the beginning of the period of the contract, and you don't need to go back each year in the contract to approve them. The money can be spent as previously approved by the voters for the period of the contract. I know I'm talking a lot, so I hope if you have questions, you'll stop me. So as we talk about appropriating money, and we mentioned sort of warrant articles, we know we have our operating budget is in one warrant article, and then we have all these different warrant articles that may contain other purposes for spending, other budgetary warrant articles. And the thing to keep in mind about warrant articles is that while all warrant articles are separate, they're all separate from one another. Some separate warrant articles are also special warrant articles, and they're special because they have special rules. So if they fall into a special category, then they have special rules attached to them. So it's a very obvious name: special warrant articles, special rules. So what are special? What separate articles also qualify as special? And they're found here in this section in 32 section 3, but any warrant article that contains an appropriation, so that seeks to appropriate money, and is also one of these things, is a petitioned warrant article, is a warrant article containing a bond, to get a bond to go into long-term debt, is a warrant article putting money into a capital reserve fund or another town-funded trust fund, or is just simply designated as non-lapsing, non-transferable, or even just as special, is a special warrant article. And the special rules of special warrant articles, the big ones, are up here on the screen. The first one is that if it's a special warrant article, there's no ability to transfer money from that purpose to another one. So it still doesn't mean you have to spend all that money on that purpose, but the select board can't move that special money to some other different purpose as it generally could for other types of appropriation. So that's a big one. But the other two are pretty significant as well. So if you have a special warrant article, one of the general rules of budgeting is that at the end of the budget year, your appropriations lapse, meaning you get this budget and these separate appropriations, and they're good for 1 year, right? The budget year ends and they turn into a pumpkin. You can't spend that money anymore. You have to appropriate it again if you want to spend it in the next town meeting. But if it's a special warrant article, then the select board actually has the authority to vote to carry it over for one more budget year, and it's called encumbering it. They have the authority to encumber it for one more year, which is an unusual thing that only applies in these circumstances. Additionally, any special warrant article can actually be designated. So when the select board writes the warrant article and puts it on the warrant, they can actually say in the language of the warrant article that it's designated as non-lapsing, so as carrying over for a period of up to 5 years, which is another unusual thing that you generally can't do with appropriations, is just carry them over from budget year to budget year. So those are 3 very special rules about how special warrant articles work. And so when you think about, well, why do I care whether, it's special or separate? These are the reasons why, because there are different things that simply can be done with special warrant articles that can't be done with separate warrant articles. Another sort of key principle of budget law and a requirement from the statute 32 section 5. And by the way, 32 section 5, if there were any section in chapter 32 in the municipal budget law that is worth reading 100 times, is section 5, because this really has sort of all the meat of the procedural requirements, the budget hearing requirements, the gross basis budgeting requirements, all sorts of other things are sort of in this particular section of municipal budget law. But this is a very sort of basic requirement of budgeting in general, that when you budget, not only do your budget is this big picture bottom line budget, right? And so when you budget, you not only budget for all the money you want to have appropriated, all the money, to be authorized to be spent, but you also budget for all the offsetting revenue, right? The money that comes in order to offset what's being appropriated or what you hope will be appropriated for the budget year. So there's that requirement to show both planned expenditures as well as planned revenues. So, when you're budgeting and you're looking at revenues, you're obviously looking at the revenues that have come in from this past year to make determinations and projections about what the revenues will be this year. And that's another reason why reviewing expenditures as well as reviewing revenues is important throughout the budget year for planning for the following year. But this sort of concept also comes back to that idea or that requirement that when you are trying to appropriate money for a specific purpose, that the warrant article not only state the amount of money to be appropriated, but also states all the sources from where that money is coming, right? So we talked about you've got the project and some money's coming from a capital reserve fund and some money's coming from taxation. You've got to clarify, or the drafters of the warrant article have to clarify that this amount of it is coming from taxation, this amount of it is coming from the capital reserve fund, which totals up to a grand total of X. And we've actually seen warrant articles get disallowed because they were drafted without ever specifying either the total, the amount to be appropriated, or perhaps it says, $100,000 to come from 3 sources. And it doesn't say how much to come from 3 sources. And no one, not DRA, not anyone, is going to sort of guess at what the voters intended or what the thought process was when drafting that warrant article. That the drafter of the warrant article has to specify that so that it all adds up to the grand total being sought in the warrant article. So as still talking about appropriations and appropriating money for a particular purpose, some of this we've touched upon when we talked about the Budget Committee's responsibility for holding the public budget hearings. Every appropriation, whether it's the operating budget itself or any of those other separate or special warrant articles containing budgetary amounts, containing appropriations, All of them need to be part of the public budget hearing or public budget hearings if you end up needing to have more than one. All amounts and purposes have to be discussed or disclosed, and no new amounts or no increased amounts can be inserted after the budget hearing without holding just another budget hearing. So it's perfectly fine to change it afterwards. You just need to hold another public budget hearing. The requirement for gross basis budgeting, as we talked about, applies to appropriations. And sort of two other big things that are required for appropriations to be valid, which we're going to talk about separately, are recommendations on warrant articles containing appropriations, and also warrant notice prior to town meetings so that the public has notice of what they're voting on. So let's talk about those two big ones: recommendations on warrant articles and warrant notice. So this is a really important one, and I sort of put on here warrant article notations, because there are a few little things that warrant articles are allowed to have, or maybe are required to have, sort of informationally after the text of the warrant article itself. And just to sort of backtrack or be very clear, although the budget committee is responsible for the operating budget, which goes to the voters essentially in a warrant article with a bottom line figure, all these other warrant articles containing appropriations, they do not originate with the budget committee. That's not part of sort of the budget committee's wheelhouse. They originate instead generally from the select board, because the select board can put any article on the warrant that it wishes. They are the drafters ultimately of the warrant. That's their responsibility. But warrant articles can also come from citizens through the citizen petition process. And so you're going to have your operating budget, and then you're going to have all of these other warrant articles, some of which contain money that either came from the select board or came from the petitioned warrant article process. And as we saw in an earlier slide, every petitioned article that contains an appropriation is a special article, right? So they fall into the special category if they are petitioned and contain money. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that when we're talking about warrant articles, they are drafted elsewhere, but they become your responsibility in the sense that if they contain money, they have to be part of your public budget hearing process. And you have certain responsibilities with either recommending or not recommending them. And if you recommend them, they become part of your total recommended appropriations for the purpose of the 10% rule. And if you don't recommend them, then they become an over and above your recommended total appropriations for the purpose of the 10% rule. So your recommendations, they matter, right? And that's why they're statutorily required on certain articles. So first up here, we see 32 Section 5, which basically says that both the Budget Committee and the Select Board is obligated to put either its recommendation or non-recommendation on all special warrant articles. That's like the very basic bare minimum legal requirement, that both the governing body and the Budget Committee will decide, yes or no, we recommend these special articles. So the petition, the capital reserve, the bond, all of those listed in the special article category. Another reason why we care whether articles are special or not. But another section of the law, and it's found in 32 Section 5, but the same exact language is also in 40 Section 13, which is often thought of as the SB2 statute. So that's relevant to you all. Another section of the law allows towns to require the Budget Committee and Select Board to put numeric tally votes on all warrant articles. And for the Budget Committee, that would mean all warrant articles containing appropriations, whether they're special or not. And for the Select Board, they have the authority inherently as the governing body to put their recommendations on any warrant articles, whether they contain money or not. But if you are, and you probably know this, do you have, or have you been dictated to put your numeric tallies on warrant articles? Yes. So,
2009.
and what was it? 2009. There you go, 2009. So you, like many budget committees, actually have to not only decide whether to recommend or not recommend every single article that contains an appropriation, but you actually put your vote in that little notation. Budget committee recommends 7-2, whatever the vote is. And that is essentially supposed to be additional information for voters to take into account when they're voting, to see whether the budget committee thought this was a good idea or didn't think it was a good idea. And that includes seeing the way in which the committee voted. So that's really important. And that you have that. Yes.
And so if we are tied, then it is does not recommend.
That's correct. So, if the motion is to recommend, I move to budget committee to recommend article number 4, and a tie vote is a failure of a vote. And so I suppose, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, there could be a secondary motion to not recommend it, which may again be a tie vote. So it makes no difference. But a tied vote, you can't say that the budget committee recommends it under those circumstances. Are you an even numbered budget committee?
No.
Okay.
But we don't always have.
I know. Yes. And that's why even numbered boards can be tricky on their own, because of the possibility for tied votes under the circumstances. So that's really important. The recommending is important for the 10% rule, and it's just simply important for voter information about whether the budget committee recommends it or not. Has Litchfield of the voters authorized the estimated tax impact to be placed on articles? Okay, so that's one other piece of information that's not something the budget committee has to do, that's something the select board has to do or is responsible for having someone do. And that essentially just indicates what the estimated tax impact of adopting this article would be. It's estimated only, right? We can't say that that is indeed what the tax impact will be, especially because you can only work off of last year's tax rate. So in that sense, it's very much estimated, because it's hard to say what it would be this particular year. But what's also important about these notations is that these are the only additional things that go on the warrant following the warrant articles. So the law allows certain types of information to be placed on the warrant after the warrant articles, and these are those things. And they're supposed to be helpful to the voters in making decisions about what to do and what not to do. So the other big sort of procedural requirement we mentioned for appropriations to be valid, and frankly, these are requirements for anything that the voters do at town meeting to be valid, is that there has to be warrant notice. The warrant is the document, obviously, that is posted prior to town meeting. It lists out all the different things to be voted on at town meeting, and it is called a warrant because it's essentially a warning of these are the things that are going to be talked about at the deliberative session and then ultimately voted on at the ballot session voting day to follow. And that's the voters' chance to look at the warrant and decide whether they care enough about the things on it to come out or stay at home. So you'll hear that sort of so-called stay-at-home rule, or have they been given sufficient notice of the subject matter to be discussed and talked about at town meeting and to be voted on at town meeting. And so we've just listed out the statutes that require warning both of appropriations and also just generally of any subject matter to be voted at town meeting. Obviously, voters can amend warrant articles, and even in an SB2 town at the deliberative session, they have the power to amend warrant articles. When we're talking about money articles, they can change the amount, they can increase it, they can decrease it. And they can even change language in the warrant article as long as they don't change the subject matter so much, they effectively eliminate the subject matter of the warrant article itself. So they can make pretty substantial changes, but the subject matter has to stay the same, right? The subject matter is what has been warned for the voters. So you can't insert an entirely new piece of subject matter through the amendment process. And it's also important, and we get this question, that petitioned warrant articles can be amended in the same way that any other warrant articles can be amended. And really the idea here is that, getting your warrant article on the warrant is your right if you go through the petitioned warrant article process. But once it gets to the legislative body, they get to legislate, right? They have the power ultimately to amend and change and vote on it, approve it or not approve it, because it's all part of a legislative process. So we talked about, no spending without an appropriation. We talked about the exceptions to the rule, things that you can or have to spend money on even without an appropriation. And we also talked a little bit about, what happens if more or less money is to be spent on particular appropriations than what was authorized. So we have this rule that many of you who are involved in the budget world are probably aware of, what we all like to call the no means no rule. And it's found here in this section 32, section 10. And it basically says that the voters have some power to actually prohibit spending on a particular purpose, but in very limited circumstances. So if voting to appropriate is a guiding principle, if it's an authorization to spend money, there are also some circumstances where a vote or an amendment can actually create a prohibition on spending money for that purpose. So two big things if they happen. If a budget line item, and I'm talking about like the DRA budget form that has sort of the big line items, right? Like executive, administrative, it has sort of the big chunks of the budget in there. If one of those line items is reduced to zero, which I've never seen happen, or if a separate warrant article with an appropriation is defeated, they vote no on it, then basically what that means is the town is not allowed to spend money on that particular purpose for that budget year. And usually this just happens in the form of a warrant article. It contains money to buy, new boots for this department, and the voters say no, they don't adopt it at the ballot session. And that no vote on that warrant article means no spending money for that purpose throughout that budget year. Even if you can find some extra money to play with in the budget, the no means no rule is going to kick in. So that applies in those limited circumstances, but it's certainly important to be aware of that can happen if you get a no vote on a warrant article, or in the rarer circumstance where an entire line on the DRA posted budget got zeroed out. And, this is a good time to mention too, that with regard to amendments to the operating budget itself, the operating budget is a bottom line budget. When it's adopted by the voters, they're adopting that bottom line figure that's represented as the total of the budget. And so while voters could make changes to the bottom line budget, that's the effect of an amendment to the budget, is just a change to the bottom line total of the budget. So it's just something to keep in mind. Spending limitations, we've already talked a little bit about those. We talked about the 10% limitation. The voters can't appropriate more than 10% more than the budget committee's total recommended appropriations. And there are certain things that get excluded when you total things up, and I won't bore you to death with the details of what those are. Those are listed in the statute, what is, subtracted out of the total. And there's also, some towns have adopted tax or spending caps. So I see
Town side.
on the town side, is it a percentage? Or
I believe it's an amount.
It's an amount. Okay. So basically what this is at some point in the past, the voters voted via warrant article to adopt the tax or the spending cap. It creates limitations on annual increases. It's either a dollar amount or a fixed percentage. And the proposed amount raised by taxes can't exceed the prior year by more than whatever that dollar amount or percentage amount is. Okay. And that's just sort of a way of regulating increases from year to year or paying attention to increases from year to year. And again, it's a local option, something that the voters have to adopt in order for it to exist. And it can similarly be rescinded by the voters at a later date. Transfer of appropriations, we've touched upon this a little bit too. So the same section of the law that talks about the no means no rule, no spending if the warrant article is defeated, that same section of 32 talks about the authority to transfer money from one appropriation to another. So from one purpose to another. And this can be, generally you see this in the operating budget, money being transferred from one place in the operating budget to another place in the operating budget. This authority is the spending agent's authority. So the select board or the town manager in municipalities, the transfer authority belongs to them because they're the spenders of the budget once the voters adopt it. And it just really allows the select board essentially to consider changes that arise during the year. So if the budget is a plan and we planned that this department would need X amount of dollars, but there's a much bigger need for something else within the operating budget, we need to spend more than we planned on salt and sand for a much worse winter, or we didn't have a bad winter but there's a deficit, a need in a different department of the town. There's just an ability to sort of move money around to actually meet the needs as they come out through the year, of course with the restriction being that you must stay within your bottom line total budget, and there's no going over that bottom line budget. When it comes to transfer authority, this is not something that the voters can vote to restrict. So there can't be a vote to prohibit the spending of more or less than what's represented in the budgetary lines. This is a statutory authority that is given by law to the select board. And there are requirements too, just from a bookkeeping perspective, to show how the money is being, transferred, or this department is being overspent because this department is being underspent, to just show that there is a matchup between the spending that's happening within the budget. With special warrant articles, we said that you can't transfer money out of special warrant articles. So, you get 20,000 and you want to spend 5 of it on some other purpose, that's not allowed. But you can transfer money in, right? So like if you had a special warrant article for a project and there was actually more money needed, more money could be spent on it, but you can't send money out to a different purpose, essentially.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Who controls that?
Who controls
the insurance that the money is used for the purpose that it's intended to?
Yeah, that is the select board's responsibility to do that. And like I said, there are requirements that, the books show how that money is being spent. As far as specific oversight, there's no higher up authority that directly oversees it or manages it. But that is what the law requires. And, as the budget committee reviews expenditures throughout the year, while they don't, enforce it, they pay attention to the way in which money is being spent throughout the year. All right, so SB2 and budgeting. There are some differences, obviously, in your SB2 world. For one thing, how long has Litchfield been SB2? A long time?
Since 98.
Since 98. All right. Okay. So that is a while. When you have a March town meeting and you're not SB2, you have later deadlines for your March meeting. But because SB2 municipalities have your deliberative session much earlier, your deadlines are also earlier for getting the budget together and holding the budget hearings and everything like that. So when you look at 32 Section 5 in the municipal budget law, you want to ignore the deadlines that you see in 32 section 5 because the deadlines for you as an SB2 municipality are actually in 4013. And you probably know that, but it never hurts to be reminded. Actually, the SB2 deadlines are much easier because the traditional town meeting, it's always like, not less than 15 days or more. I know, but with the SB2, it's like the second Tuesday. That's your deadline, right? So it's a little bit clearer cut with the SB2 municipalities. Obviously, you know that the big difference between SB2 and traditional town meeting is that ultimately everything gets voted on by official ballot, right? So you have your deliberative, there are amendments, there's deliberation, but ultimately the yes or no voting on those articles happens on a ballot, and it happens just like a regular election. And because of that, because everything gets voted on by official ballot, if the voters say no to your operating budget, there has to be something that happens, right? And the something that happens is the default budget. And perhaps nothing is trickier about the SB2 form of government than the default budget. And it has had many permutations in the law over the years by the legislature. Essentially, what the default budget is it's what we get if the voters say no to our proposed budget, right? And technically, and not even technically, the law does allow SB2 municipalities to have a special meeting just to reconsider the operating budget. So the default budget, you don't have to go right to it, but that is what happens most of the time, right? Holding a separate another town meeting to consider the operating budget I can certainly appreciate that's a big deal. So you have to have a default budget going into budget season. There has to be a default budget calculated. Yes.
What happens if this budget committee doesn't approve our own budget? If we don't vote all in favor of the budget that we're presenting?
So you don't have to vote all in favor. Any committee works through a quorum of itself. So you just need a majority to.
What if we don't have a majority?
That's a problem. I mean, as a committee, you have a statutory obligation to come up with a proposed budget to give to the voters. So I would say there is an obligation that at the end of the day, you come to some form of consensus on what the budget is, because a budget from you as a committee has to be done and posted by the deadline. That is your responsibility to do that. So I'm not sure I have a great answer to that, except that is your statutory responsibility, is to propose a budget to the voters. Yep. And so the default budget is calculated by the select board, unless you're a town who voted to give it to the budget committee. So you guys don't have to do that, right? So that is an option for the voters actually to vote by warrant article to delegate it. So I won't say that anymore. But the default setting for the default budget is the select board has the responsibility to calculate it. It's seemingly very simple. The idea behind the default budget is that it is last year's budget. That's the idea, is that we have our proposed budget, and then if the voters don't approve it, we get last year's budget. But per the definition of default budget in 40 section 13, there are certain things that must come out of last year's budget, or can be decreased, or must be decreased, or must be increased depending on certain circumstances. And really, that's where the most confusion with the default budget comes, is what are the so-called one-time expenditures from last year that you don't put in this year? What qualifies as a contract that you can add in those increases to the default budget, and things of that nature. So because you don't have to do that default budget, I will just say that that is the governing body's responsibility, and that you need to have that by the time you hold that first budget hearing, so that can be included in that public notice that you give to the voters.
Good job, Troy.
Thank you.
Lapse of appropriations. We've touched upon this a little bit when we talked about, special warrant articles and how they can be allowed to hold over for another year or hold over for up to 5 years. So the general rule of budgeting in the municipal world is that you get the money for 1 year, one budget year. And then at the end of the year, it lapses. And all that means, really, the way that I like to think about it, is the authority to spend it goes away, right? And it goes into this sort of general fund thing where it has to be appropriated again by the voters at the next town meeting in order to be spent, right? It loses that appropriation authority that it got at town meeting. And so this is the statute 32, section 7. All appropriations shall lapse at the end of the fiscal year, and any unexpended portion, it shall not be expended without further appropriation. But of course, we know there have to be exceptions to the lapse rule. There aren't a ton, but there are some really important ones. One of the things that can happen is that before the end of the budget year, if the money has been legally encumbered by a legal obligation, it can be held over until the next budget year. So the most classic example of this is, a purchase order is made for items in the 2019 budget year. It's made in December and the town has become legally obligated to pay it, but the payment doesn't become, you don't make the payment until mid-January. But because of that purchase order, you had a legal obligation to pay it. Those funds would not lapse. You would be still allowed to pay that money because it became legally encumbered during that budget year. Other money that doesn't lapse is just non-lapsing funds. So capital reserve funds, trust funds, they don't lapse. The money goes in and they live on. They exist from year to year. And appropriation to capital reserve fund. There are other non-lapsing funds. If you have a revolving fund in your town, if you have a special revenue fund for a specific purpose, those funds, the money goes in and they don't lapse. They live on. And special warrant articles, we already said they can be encumbered for one more year, or the warrant article itself can be made non-lapsing for up to 5 years. So those are sort of the basic rules of non-lapsing, or the rule of lapse and non-lapsing appropriations. So one more little point before I turn it over to Nate to talk about some specific types of funds. Special meetings. It is possible for the municipality to realize that it did not appropriate money it needs, or that something has come up that was unexpected, and that additional funds need to be sought from the voters, approval to spend money from the voters. So we talked about earlier that DRA can do an approval process for funds that weren't appropriated, but there is also the ability of the voters or for the town to hold a special meeting to appropriate money for a specific purpose. But it's a really sort of difficult set of standards that have to be met. There has to be some kind of emergency. So for example, I think it was the town of Hampton, maybe 2 years ago, they had a huge, I'm trying to remember, maybe a giant water main break, some giant road project that needed to be done and fixed. It was an emergency, and they had certainly not appropriated the extra money. So they went through a special meeting process to get approval for that project. And so you have to have an emergency, and you actually have to go to court and establish what your emergency is in order to get permission to hold that special meeting, in order to have, to appropriate money at a special meeting. If it's a special meeting and it's not to appropriate money, you don't have to go through all those hurdles. But if it is to appropriate sort of additional money that wasn't appropriated at the annual meeting, you do. So are there any sort of general questions on that before we talk about some very sort of specific types of appropriations and other types of funds before we wrap it up? All right.
All right. Seeing none. Now that we've talked about some emergencies, we're moving on to the fun section, where the legislature has provided a model of clarity by naming everything very similarly. So everything has capital in it, everything has fund, everything has, reserve in it. So there are a couple multi-year appropriation abilities that the municipalities have. The first is a lease or a purchase agreement. Typically, these are lease agreements. So, you're getting a fire truck. It's over a multi-year period. You're leasing it. Same thing for an ambulance. Some large piece of equipment is generally the subject of these. So if the lease contains an escape clause, so if it contains the ability for the municipality to not pay for the full lease, then you can approve these with a simple majority. So typically this would be, we rent the ambulance if the town voters do not vote to renew that lease or reappropriate that money to renew that lease, then that ambulance goes back to whatever company. If there's no escape clause, you need a supermajority. Since you're an SB2 town, that's 3/5. Non-SB2 towns are 2/3 in order to approve those. Similarly, with capital projects, you have to have an identified capital project, and those are actually listed in the statute themselves. These are usually fairly specific things. We're not talking about a generic fund where you're talking about, hey, we want to improve all town buildings. Generally, you have this fund for a very specific project purpose. You're building a new library, you're building a new town hall, you're building a public safety complex, something like that. These don't lapse, and you have the governing body has the ability to expend these for up to the 5-year period. And the reason for the non-lapse is because these are construction projects usually, and we all know how on time construction projects always are. They're always delivered on time. And so
Never any problem.
And so when that invoice comes year 2 instead of year 1, the governing body can still pay it. And this is included in the default budget, which makes sense because again, it's a construction project. We know that there are those delays as well. Similarly, we come to the common municipal funds, the capital reserve funds, the trust funds, special revenue funds, revolving funds. I'm not going to lie; these are very confusing. I call them the IRAs of municipal funds because there's a lot of overlap. The capital reserve funds and the special revenue funds up until 1993, they were commonly confused by municipalities. There were a lot of disallowances. The legislature went back, fixed those. So they're actually fairly similar at this point in time. The thing to remember is capital reserve funds is that the town has to specifically move money out of them, whereas special revenue funds, you're moving money into those. Similarly, well, not similarly, but somewhat differently, trust funds are a little bit more complicated in that they're held by the trustee of trust funds, and the legislative body has to, when they set them up, figure out, how those are going to be spent, if it's just going to be principal, if it's just going to be interest, if it's going to be both, and puts restrictions on those. And we have revolving funds as well. And I'm going to go through each one of these so you get a little bit more detail. So the capital reserve funds are created by a majority vote of the legislative body. And there's a hearing prior to creating those. Again, if you're discontinuing those, it requires a majority vote. And you can change the purpose, but it requires a 2/3 vote. So most of the time what we see happen is that if one's created and there's no longer a use for that, but they want to shift that money somewhere else, what they'll do is there'll be 2 related warrant articles that says vote to discontinue it and then vote to appropriate the same amount that's in there into a new fund. And that's really what our last key here is that you can't transfer funds from those into another one. And that really just falls across the board for these special funds.
That's a classic mistake that happens is, the capital reserve fund is defunct. We don't have that purpose anymore. And so there's just maybe a warrant article, send that money from that capital reserve fund to a different one. And there has to be first a discontinuance of the first fund, and then you appropriate that money into some other fund or some other purpose.
And that's really where you're seeing amendments on the floor in terms of funds changing purposes. That's where that happens. We have special revenue funds. These require hearings prior to town meeting. There are no agents here. It's really designed to use money that the town is getting from some sort of revenue source, like if you have paid trash service or something like that, and use that money and direct it to a new specific purpose. So it could be that you have everybody in town buys, purple bags in Concord. That's what I buy. And then that money is specially allocated for repaving or something like that. And it's really to shift money from one area into a different unrelated area. And that contrasts a little bit with revolving funds, which are generally all related. Most of the time we're talking about recreational funds. You can have other ones. Ambulance fees seems to be a big one. And where municipalities run into issues here are they'll have the ambulance, they'll have the fee set up, and then the ambulance goes defunct. They're going to sell it or trade it in and get some sort of value for that. And they say, well, what do we do with that money? Because we want to use that money as the basis for the new purchase and not deplete our special revenue fund. Unfortunately, you can't just move it back into the special revenue fund. That goes into the general fund, and you have to have a special allocation. So it does get very complicated. You have these kind of, what I like to call mandatory withdrawals in sort of the parlance of IRAs.
And really revolving funds, the idea here is that they're a revolving door, right? So the money that you get from the revenue that comes in from a particular source goes into the fund and then gets spent for that activity, right? So that's why recreation is the most common. You collect fees for the recreation activities, they go into the revolving fund, they get spent for functions related to recreation. So the money is supposed to sort of go round and round to be a self-supporting fund.
That's really it for special funds. My part was very short, so.
So are we at the end here?
We are
Okay,
at the
great.
end.
So I don't know if there are any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up, anything we didn't touch upon or anything like that.
You need some water.
We have water. Thank you.
We had opened the meeting to the community, so if any of the community had questions, we'll be more than happy to entertain them. Just come up and state your name.
You shocked everyone into
This was
silence.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, thank you for having us. I hope it was helpful.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
would recommend I went to the training last September, the full day, and I could almost like follow. I still have.
I
my
see your notes.
Like,
Yeah.
you get a special like sticker with your name on it.
Just to know the information is consistent too.
Oh, it's very consistent. Yeah. But like, I would recommend if people are able to schedule it, to go to the full day. You get a lot more in depth, and it was very enlightening, and it was good to hear it a second time
Good.
too. Now that I have been on the budget committee for a little bit, so but thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you for coming.
And I will just take this down here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so you ready to move on? All right.
Yeah.
All right. I need a gavel. Boom. So we've concluded our NHMA workshop. We appreciate their attendance. The next item on the agenda. Boom. I put it in the shoe. The next item on the agenda would be public input. So please, if you'd like to come forward, state your name, address. We'd be happy to hear anything anybody may have to say. Quiet. Okay.
Is this the only opportunity?
No, there's public input
At the
at the end. Yep. So then we'll move on to the review and the acceptance of minutes. We had a set of minutes from May 23rd. Did everybody have a chance to take a look and review at them? Any comments or anything that we'd like to make? So then I will entertain a motion.
So moved.
All right, it's been a motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
You can fight over it. All right, so it's been made and seconded. So all those in favor of approving the minutes of May 23rd, please say aye and indicate by raising your hand.
Aye.
Those opposed and abstained?
Aye.
All right, thank you. So the minutes are approved. Correspondence for the past month included the standard reports that we receive, as well as information on the updated teacher's contract, which I believe we will then roll into next. Unless there's anything I missed on, other than I contacted each one of you regarding a date. But other than that, the correspondence in the record would be the reports and the contract information that we received. To which point we will then turn it over. If you'd like to come forward, we'll talk about we'll move to item number 3 that was under school business, teacher's contract update. We'll do that next.
Thanks, Carrie. Give me a second. I just got to
Absolutely.
get stuff handed out.
Oh, sorry, it's
Yeah,
all together.
that's fine.
Got it. Sorry, I thought I was being helpful. Sorry.
I thought we were sharing.
It's that whole teacher thing.
Thank you very much.
So the other teacher thing is go ahead and glance through the packet now. So that you see what you have, and then I'll walk you through a few questions.
Same as earlier, that was circulated?
This may be a little bit different because
Okay.
I've added to it a little bit.
Okay.
Like, could I actually, I don't have the last page.
No, so I want
Thanks.
Okay, so let me just start with a quick introduction. I'm Mike Jetty, the superintendent of schools. I will be finishing my first year in Litchfield in a couple of days. So it's been a great year.
Congratulations.
And we've been very busy relative to collective bargaining. And I want to walk the committee through what has happened relative to collective bargaining this year. We started the year bargaining with 2 groups, our Support Staff Association and our Teacher Association. The Support Staff Association negotiations came to an end when there was a disagreement about how to proceed relative to insurance. And we sat down with an arbitrator, tried to work that out over the course of a day, and ultimately the parties just were not able to reach agreement. So we're in a status quo situation with our support staff going into the next year. But it's the full intent of the board to sit down and try to negotiate another contract for the future because it's something that we obviously want to have in place. Our teachers were able to reach an agreement, and we brought that agreement forward. And when it came to the budget committee split on the question. And ultimately, it was a 4-4 vote, and that resulted in a non-recommendation, right? And so on the ballot that appeared in March, the budget committee did not recommend it. If you do an analysis of it, you'll see that it was actually the largest over-under relative to a vote. There were 116 people who skipped the question altogether. It ended up failing by 154 votes. And so it really tells us that there was just a lot of people unsure how to cast on that. And if you looked at anything else on the school district warrant, I think the largest over/under besides that was 39 people. So 39 people skipped the question about naming the auditorium after Phil Martin, for example. But 116 people took a pass on the teacher's contract question, Article 2, right? So didn't even cast a ballot one way or the other. So that tells us that we really need to do a good job of getting word out about what we're asking for. We think, we're surmising, we can't read the minds of 116 people, but, what did the 4-4 vote say? The budget committee split on it, and I think people were confused. They're like, I don't know what to do. We say yes or no. If 4 people said yes, 4 people said no. We're not sure what it means, but either way, it left us in a difficult situation because if you've been on the budget committee for a while or in Litchfield for a while, you know that there have been past school contracts that have failed. And so coming into this year ahead with a status quo situation, we're very worried about what's going to happen relative to teacher morale, relative to attrition, teachers who are going to leave because of not having a contract. We already have teachers who have signed agreements in neighboring districts and are getting a substantial raise because they're making up steps that they have failed to get in the past. And they're going to get a raise next year that's not being offered currently in Litchfield. So the board and the teachers sat down with the absolute best faith to say, how do we take all of this, take the feedback that we've received from the budget committee, from the voters, and renegotiate an agreement that we think is going to be fair to the taxpayers, but also fair to our teachers so that we can keep our staff going into the future. That was the objective. And I will tell you that we spent hours and hours and hours negotiating, trying to find a pathway through all of this. I think the feedback from the budget committee was first and foremost in everybody's mind. Symbolically, we had an empty chair in the room, and the empty chair represented the voters and the feedback that we got. And we were saying, okay, so whatever we think we need to do, will it pass the test of the empty chair? The people who are ultimately going to pass this agreement that we're going to bring this forward to. And in that spirit, compromises were made all across the board, and we come forward with a now ratified tentative agreement. And let me talk for a second about the steps. So the teachers ratified this right at the end of school. Ratifying means that their full membership voted on it, and they said, yes, we think this is a good deal. We think it's a fair deal, and it sure beats no deal. So they wanted to make sure that something could go forward. The board actually voted this morning in order to bring it forward. We had a little technical glitch. We thought we voted last week, but we wanted to make sure we got it right. So we re-voted today. It's on TV if anybody wants to watch that vote. And so the vote was to ratify the agreement that our team had negotiated. And it also was to petition Superior Court for a special meeting. And I'm going to talk in broad strokes about what that looks like. We think it would be somewhere toward the end of September that we would be holding a special meeting if we're allowed to do so by the courts. And if you sort of back plan off of an end of September date, we're thinking there would be a beginning of September deliberative session where we would be revealing what the terms are to the public. I mean, we're doing it now, but it would be the formal deliberative session. And if you back plan off the beginning of September deliberative, we're going to need a beginning of August recommendation from the budget committee, right? So it's sort of like what we would end up doing during the regular budget season, but we're working with September and August deadlines. And so really our deadline to have a vote from the budget committee is August 9th, and that's based on that back planning projection. So nothing here should be a surprise. It should be based upon previous communication with the budget committee. I want to dig in deep. I want to make sure that questions can be answered. And then my understanding is there'll be a special meeting at some point in the future to actually cast a vote and make a recommendation. And I'm going to be honest, I am hoping that we get a 9-0 vote to support this. And I'm saying that because we listen so closely to the feedback from this committee and from the community that we think we've done everything that's been asked of us. And the teachers are absolutely committed to having this agreement. They love teaching here. They love working with the children that are here in Litchfield. But given the choice of going to a neighboring district for a $10,000 raise or continuing on here, they're making economic choices for their family. And it's hurting us. It's absolutely hurting our ability to attract and retain quality teachers in Litchfield. So it's imperative that we come up with something that is fair. Okay, and I just have to make that appeal right up front. So let me walk you through page one. Page one is the salary, this is the cost item sheet. So this is really what makes a difference, I think.
That's the sheet?
That's that sheet, correct. Yep, so it looks like this one. So the first thing is that relative to salaries, you can see that in the first year of the agreement for next year, if approved by the voters, there would be a 1% cost of living adjustment applied across the agreement. And you have been provided copies of the actual salary grids, so you can see how 1% has been applied and what impact that has. They're not in the packet I gave you tonight, but they're in the email.
Yeah.
Year two has a 1.5% cost of living adjustment, and year three has a 1.75% cost of living adjustment. And you can see the associated costs that go with those costs of living. So teachers will make a step each year. So they're going to actually advance on the salary schedule, and the step they go to will have that cost of living adjustment applied to it. The other piece is that longevity, which was very important to our teachers, especially because we have 50% of our teachers who are at the top step. And so the only raise they get, because they're not making a step, is the cost of living adjustment. And so in year three, there's a $90 increase in the longevity stipend that is offered to teachers who achieve that top step. And so that's the only adjustment. It's $90, and it's just for the third year of this agreement. Health insurance. Both parties had previously agreed to accept the change in insurance plan, right? So we currently are on the red-green plan, which are very traditional HMO plans. And the parties have agreed to shift to what's called yellow. And there's a yellow choice plan and a yellow no choice plan. I'm not sure that's exactly without choice, I think is actually the term. And so as they make the shift from the green to the yellow, that is a change in the way they use their healthcare dollars. So currently it's an HMO plan. They go to the doctor, they put the card down. There's a $30 copay that goes into it, and that pretty much covers the rest of the expenses. When you shift into the yellow plan, you get into a deductible plan. And so now when a teacher goes to the doctor, they have to be mindful of choosing the doctor that maybe is the lower cost provider. They can't just go wherever and turn the card over. Well, they can, but they're going to have some skin in the game. They're going to pay a portion of that expense through the deductible. And so it'll cause them to be a little bit more mindful. We believe the shift from green to yellow really represents a change in the way the healthcare dollars get spent. It puts the employee at the center of making choices relative to that. If my doctor has ordered a certain procedure or test, and I know that I'm going to be paying a portion of that now, I'm going to look for the low-cost provider for that. So if one could have a colonoscopy in one location at a much lower cost than another, and the same results, right? It's just that one provider is less expensive. You're going to choose the less expensive provider because you've got deductibles that come into play. So it's that sort of concept that is the consumer-driven idea that's behind many insurance plans. I'm saying this to people who probably all have some sort of a deductible plan. And so I'm teaching you something you have lived and experienced. I'm doing that because teachers have not routinely done that. This is going to be a shift in thinking. It's going to require us to provide quite a bit of education to our employees in terms of how to use the healthcare dollars that they're provided. But it's a leap of faith on the part of the teachers who are then saying, yeah, this is a plan that we can take. We understand getting healthcare costs under control will be important down the road. And so they are making that leap of faith and making that shift over to yellow. And what's nice is the way School Care, which is our insurance provider, structures it. There are incentives that are built in relative to the choice plan. Means that there's some payment toward deductibles that comes into play. So it's not all on the employee part, but even though you're using the insurance money, you still have to be mindful of how you use the insurance money, because when it's gone, right? So it comes into play, again, that consumer-driven piece. And I think the insurance company's done a nice job of structuring it. Another thing I want to point out to the Budget Committee is we currently have in the in the green plan, an 82-18 shift cost share, right? So 82% of the cost is paid by the school district and 18% is paid by the employee. There had been an effort over time to drive this as close to 80-20 as we could get it, right? So we were trying to get so that the district would be paying 80% of the plan and the employee would be paying 20%. When you make the shift over to the yellow, to maintain an 80-20 split really is not a reasonable approach. And so I want you to take a look, if you would, at the third sheet or the last sheet, which is labeled with the colors on it. I may not have kept one for myself, but I can do it from memory. If you look at it, you'll see that basically this shows where we are with the current green plan on the three types. So it's the single plan, the two-person plan, and the family plan of insurance. And if you look at the next year with or the current year with the green, what the costs have been, I am showing you the district's contribution toward that. So I'm not showing you the employee contribution. I'm showing what we're paying, what the taxpayers are funding toward that insurance plan. Next year, in year one, we stuck with green. And we did that because we had an open enrollment period. We had to make a decision about insurance for next year, maintaining status quo, because anything could happen. The courts could deny our opportunity to have a special meeting. The voters could say no again. And so we needed to know how we were insuring our employees. So the second column or third column over is showing what the cost will be next year. And notice the cost went down. And the cost went down because, remarkably, our provider had a reduction in the cost of the insurance. And so that's relatively unheard of. We normally budget for a 10% increase. This year we had a 1% decrease. So we got lucky on that. If you then look at the next two columns that are in yellow, those show at the splits that are provided on this sheet, right? So at 88% and being paid by the district, you can see what the district costs are. They're also less. They're less because when you shift to that plan, the insurance costs less because it's a consumer-driven plan. And so there's a cost savings to the taxpayers at the 88%. And the budget committee had asked specifically, and voter feedback was they wanted to see a reduction further in the amount that the district was paying. So you can see on page 1 of this packet that we reduce it to 87% being paid by the district in year 3. So it goes from 88 to 87, a 1% change, and that shows you that there's further cost savings to the district and to the taxpayers because of that shift that occurs. The caveat being the 2 yellow columns, they don't include any insurance increase because we can't predict what the insurance company would do. So I'm not here tonight to tell you these are the exact numbers that'll occur in year 2 or year 3, but taking current numbers and applying them using the percentages, you can see that they do in fact deliver health care savings to the taxpayers, while at the same time we feel are fair agreements for our teachers. The next part that I just want to talk about are just the net costs, because really it's those cost drivers that we just summarized. It's the salaries, steps and COLAs. It's the longevity comes into play in year 3, and it's just change in insurance and our predictions on what that would end up costing. It ends up being a 3-year deal valued at $854,737. If you compare and contrast that to what was on the warrant that failed, the failed warrant was $1.1 million. So roughly 25% cost reduction in what we're bringing forward or proposing to bring forward based on the feedback that we got. And that was based on good faith bargaining and renegotiating. So the teachers gave up on the concept of makeup steps. They've sort of resigned themselves at this point in time. I mean, anything can happen in a future negotiation, but for right now, they've said, you know, it's just more important to get an agreement and to make a step and to make progress than to go back in time and make up for some of the years that we skipped. And so that's a choice that the parties make. You'll see that makeup steps are not included in this package. And that's part of the reason why we've been able to deliver something that's $260,000 less than what the committee had split on prior. And so that's what we're proposing to bring forward. You can see the numbers spelled out in terms of the 3-year deal. You have a full copy of the TA in the email, right? So in the first email that Carrie sent referencing back, it was actually 2 separate TAs that were signed. This time we brought it all forward into one document, and you'll see that it's got Tina and Sean's initials on the bottom of it, and they're dated 6/28/19, hot off the press. And so it's really essentially the same document, updated with some of the insurance numbers that are reflected here, and it's in one document and not 2. You can see that there is the salary grid also included, so you can see exactly where that lands. That's in the email that came to everybody. I failed to do this. I'm going to turn around and pass these around to people in the public. I should have had these handed out prior because they could have been looking at this with us. And if I can just speak to the insurance part for a minute. So we do have a peer cohort group that we pay attention to, and we've done analyses against our insurance to other districts that are in our peer cohort group. And I can tell you that, you know, this is proposing that teachers pay up to 13% in year 3, right? And if we look at the other peer cohort, there's really nobody who's in that ballpark. So I'll give you an example. Bow has a very similar plan. The Bow district, they pay 99% of the cost, and the employees pay 1%. So that's a significant shift compared to 87/13. Hopkinton, I'll give you the employee pay portion. The employees there pay 8%, because that's what our employees look at when they're looking at a contract somewhere else, right? So they're going to be looking at 13% in Litchfield and 8% in Hopkinton. Hudson, it's yellow with choice. The employee pays 7%. We're looking at 13. Londonderry is on the green plan, so they're at 80/20, but again, it's the green plan, so it's not comparable to where we're headed. Merrimack is on an HMO and employees are paying 15%. In Moulton Borough, employees pay 1%. In Pelham, employees pay 15%. So that's one district that's a little bit, at least in the ballpark of where we're headed. And Windham is 8%. So we did pay attention to our peer cohort and tried to get something that would, again, be fair to teachers and not result in a great need to out-migrate. The last thing I just want to mention to the budget committee, and this I'm doing at a little bit of a risk because I'm talking about the state budget. And the state budget, as we know, is delayed. All the signals coming out of Concord are, you might have a budget by September. I'm hoping that we have a budget by the time that we have a special election if all the cards line up and this goes through. But one thing that seems pretty clear about the state budget is that they're really trying to do something relative to education funding. There's, regardless of where you stand on the issue, everybody is saying we need to help the schools, right? And the other piece is the notion of property tax relief. I think it's been heard in Concord that when you're funding schools on local property taxpayers, that it creates some inequities and some imbalances. And so they are trying to address that. So this is the spreadsheet that I got the other day on the current latest law. I'm not going to read the exact numbers, but I can tell you Litchfield is a district that stands to make a substantial amount relative to other towns. Okay. If you look at our peer cohort group, we make more than anybody. Part of it is because the formula is really recognizing the fiscal capacity of a town. And it's got to do with the equalized value that's in each town. And so towns like us make out under the plan. And so this is sort of unanticipated revenue, if you would. We were expecting some state aid, but we didn't know what it was going to look like. But this is unanticipated revenue that will be coming our way. And I think an argument can be made that as the state provides some of this additional revenue, taking a portion of it and putting it back into our teachers and investing in our number one resource. Our number one resource are our teachers in the classroom. And investing back into them makes sense. And so I just want the budget committee to be aware that I'm not just coming saying we're looking for additional money. We're also benefiting from additional revenue. And the dollar amounts that are on here exceed the ask. So in other words, we can provide a teacher agreement with the additional revenue that's coming our way and still provide tax relief to our citizens. By being smart about the way we utilize this. And so it's just another piece of the puzzle. No guarantees that that's where it's going to land, but I just want everybody to just be aware that it's not just an ask for money to spend, but in fact, there is revenue to help offset some of that. So that's my presentation. Happy to take questions, or if there are any board members who think I missed something, I'd be happy to have that clarified too.
So just a point of clarification on that last point, because that's very interesting to hear. So are we to assume as a budget committee that there's a quote gentleman's agreement that if the state funding comes back to us, that money would be applied to this and not to other things?
Be applied to the teacher's contract?
Yeah.
So we had revenue projections that were in our proposed budget that resulted in a calculated tax impact, right? The revenue projections are going to come in greater if this goes into play. And so what that'll do is it'll result in less of a need to raise local taxes because we'll have more money coming from the state allocation. So
one of my concerns is knowing that this is going to happen in September, your tax bill, if this is applied, could be negatively impacted or more negatively impacted for your second half of the year, right? But you're saying that wouldn't happen because the revenues are greater than you originally anticipated when we originally passed the first budget.
That's my understanding of the way it would play. So a couple of things. We've made a petition to DRA today. So after the board met, Michelle drove the petition over to the attorney's office, who then filed with Department of Revenue Administration to let them know that we're in the process of requesting a special meeting. What that means is DRA will hold off on tax rate setting for us as long as they can. I mean, they're not going to hold off until next year, right? They're going to, knowing that we have a potential special meeting coming, they'll hold off on that tax rate setting. And the reason is, here's the worst thing to do. Set the tax rate get a special meeting, and then have a new spending allocation that you then have to send a supplementary tax bill. Nobody wants a supplementary tax bill.
Got it.
Nobody does. So all of it will be factored in. The tax rate will be held off until all the revenues are known by, a definite amount, and all the expenditures are known by a definite amount. So they should offset, Jen, is the way I understand it, because if we're asking in year one of this agreement, it would be a $256,000 allocation, right? That would be supplemental. We've projected on the sheet that that's a 28% tax increase if it all comes based on the property in town, right? But on this sheet, when I look at it, and I'll read what this says, it says that Litchfield stands to make $429,000 in additional revenue because they are applying the formula to full day kindergarten. So having full day K will pay because they'll be paying in the full amount. And the other thing they've done is they've restored stabilization funds in the proposed budget. So the point I'm making is that there's $429,000 in revenue that we weren't expecting. At the same time, we're asking to spend $256,000. And so where's the rest of the money go to reduce the tax rate that we've already voted on because it's extra revenue?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
But is it safe to say that that's all speculation at this point?
Yeah.
I've already said that. Yes. So thank you for bringing me right back to my opening line.
Sure.
This is all sausage making in Concord, and we know that that is ugly, right? And so could this all change? Absolutely. But I also think it's safe to say that if you read the news, education is at the forefront of what they're trying to do, and everybody's very interested in property tax relief and providing for education funding. There's another lawsuit that the legislature is being accused of not meeting their obligation, right? And so I think everybody up there right now is tuned into that fact. So to say we would get zero, I would find that a big stretch, but it is definitely, notice that we didn't spend 429. We are being very cognizant of what we need to do relative to being fair to taxpayers and also fair to our teachers.
How much is the deductible on the new plan that you're proposing?
So it varies by the employee. And so I think a fair way to think about it is it's $1,000 for an employee. But with the choice plan, they would have $500, and I'm just going to do individuals because then it's different at a two-person or a family plan. But they would have $500 available to spend out of the choice fund. So it's $500 of the insurer's money that they would access first, and then they would be liable for the second $500 out of their own pocket. And so this allows the employee and the insurance company to work together because the employee is going to want to stretch that $500 that's provided as far as they can. And so they're, again, going to be mindful of the insurance choices that they make.
So out of their own pocket, it'll cost them $500.
If they get to that level, that's correct.
So no other out-of-pocket expenses?
Well, for the individual, no.
Family plan order, okay.
So a family plan, it's a $4,000 maximum. So remember, a family is going to be 3 or more. So it's going to vary by family in terms of figuring out what that means by an individual.
Okay.
And they have access to $2,000 of the insurance company's money to spend. So then they're personally on the hook for $2,000. And again, it's complicated because if you have 3 people, but there's individual maximums that go into that. And so it's, that's what I mean about the education piece is going to be big for us.
And how are you making that 4,000 up to the family member?
So it's done through the cost of living and the steps that are being awarded. I can assure you that the LEA was very cognizant. They were looking at their members, they were looking at what raises people would get, and they were making sure that the individual members would not be harmed in the process of this. And so that's how, you might look at it and say, why is it a 1.75%? It's a weird number, right? Well, the reason is because it was making sure that individual employees did not go backward relative to the insurance at the same time that they were able to make that shift.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I certainly have questions, but
I'm sorry.
I have questions, but does anyone else have questions?
I got one. I was just looking at the tax increase of, what was it, 28 cents per thousand? Estimating, just, I mean, I know it's probably a low number for Litchfield, but the house is at about 350 grand, gives about $98 to $100 raising the taxes. If you get that $450 that you're, or 450,000 you're talking about, so that's going to lower that tax impact, right? It's not going to be 28 cents anymore. You're thinking it's going to go down to.
Yeah, I mean, so it's additional, no, the tax impact is still there, but then the
Right.
revenue coming from the state offsets it. So I don't know if
Ultimately,
I'm
I think-
describing that the right
I
way.
think
but-
you need to keep them two issues separate because one, you don't know if you're going to get it. Is the contract as proposed, something we can support? Regard that. Disregard any potential income that may or may not come. Is what's being proposed something that we feel we support, regardless of whether or not we might get a windfall money somewhere else?
Brian, I think to clarify it, if 400,000 did show up, that would be offset for the next year. It wouldn't impact the 28 this year. It would possibly offset for next year. Okay.
So a question that I have, you had mentioned at the very start, right? Teacher morale, attrition, right? Some are leaving for substantial raises. You mentioned $10,000 in another district, right? And when I look at the COLA that's proposed, it doesn't even match any of that, right? It's not even close to $10,000 across the board, whether you're a 30-year tenure or whether you're on step one, right? So how far is this really going to actually increase teacher morale, knowing that it's still employment at will, right? If a teacher wants to leave for another district because it's substantially better for their family because it's a $10,000 increase, that's what they're going to do, right? So how far is this really going in terms of actually improving teacher morale over the next few years?
So it's a great point. So teacher morale is a hard thing to measure, right? The teacher who gets frustrated because every day the copier is broken, that takes a chip out of your morale, right? You go down, you just need your copies for class and it's not working, or the internet's down because now you've got your one-to-one Chromebook initiative and you can't even get on the internet. So it makes the device relatively useless at that point in time. That's a teacher morale thing. So it's a really hard measure to make as to what that means. But I can tell you that coming back with no increase, coming back making last year's money is certainly a thing that chips into that morale. So is this a makeup? No, it's not. The last agreement that cost $260,000 more made more effort to make up for some of that, but the voters said no to it. And so we have to be aware that the voters said we can't afford making those steps up, right? So we've done the best we can within the parameters that we think will get us an ability to say, I don't want to say this is better than nothing, but it's better than nothing. Not having a step, not having a cost of living increase, this in fact at least addresses that. So there are a lot of things that impact teacher morale, but one of them is being valued by the community that you serve. And I think this sends a signal from the budget committee to the teachers because they paid attention. They were in the meeting. Those of you who were on the budget committee at the time, they were upset by the vote because they thought they had done everything they could. And they thought it was fair and they thought that it was addressing some of the issues from the past. And so this can send a signal to our teachers that we do value them and that we want to keep them.
Of course.
Will somebody, if it then goes down to an $8,000 increase somewhere else, there will be some families who will make that choice. But people are not out looking because they're dissatisfied here. They just, at the end of the day, they're looking at escalating costs in their own households, the cost of taxes going up in their own communities, and they're saying they've got to exercise something to do an offset on that.
So to Andrew's question, do we have an idea of what the vote looked like on the teachers union? Was it overwhelmingly passed or was it close?
I didn't ask that question, so I don't know.
Because one concern I would have is if we support this and then I'm, being campaigned against by people who I thought I was supporting, then, that's kind of difficult to do. If they vote, if it's a close vote and there are people who are saying, I really would rather not have that pass, I'd like to go again, then what do I do? So I guess, is it a strongly supported or is it lukewarm? Is it 50 plus one vote? Is it overwhelming?
Yeah, so I would have to check with the teachers on that. I can tell you that the bargaining team was unanimous in supporting this, brought it to their membership and advocated with their membership to support this. So, but we can inquire to see if there's a vote that's there.
I just want a
Let's
degree of support is really what I'm interested in.
Let's say it's 93%.
Right,
Play the game for a minute. So 7 teachers then out of 100
right.
are going to be saying, I'm not in favor of it. So I can't.
That's easier than 49 though.
But I can't sit here and tell you you're not going to run across a teacher who's going to say, I think no deal was better than this deal.
Right.
Somebody could exist out there, absolutely. But
I'm just looking for degree of support. Is it
Yep.
strongly supported or we squeaked by? So
I'll inquire. I did not ask. I was told the agreement was ratified. So
okay.
the board voted 5-0. I can tell you that one.
A couple of other questions, if I may. I noticed there's longevity payments, as I think have been in these agreements in the past, right? How in line with industry and with our other neighboring towns are they?
Yep.
Are they comparable? Are they?
So let me talk about longevity for a second. So we looked again at our peer cohort group and did a comparison to what was there. So let me talk about Bow. Bow longevity payments are actually calculated based on the track that a teacher is on. So they get more if they're a master's plus 30 person than if they're a straight bachelor's degree. So they tie it into the track. They also start paying the longevity at year 10, whereas we hold off until year 15. So they have 5 years previous payments that they can count on. And when they start getting it 5 years early, it's $1,000 more than what we pay. So you're looking at $5,000 compounded, depending on where they are on the track. And so that's one example where it comes in sooner than us. There are other districts where the longevity is held off until year 20. So it really varies when people see longevity coming into play. And I'll give you another example. Bedford pays half of what we pay. But if you look at the salaries, they're considerably higher. So, they're not paying as much in longevity, but their salaries are higher. So you quickly, as you get into looking at this, you quickly realize that it's a lot of apples and oranges, and you're trying to line up how it works out. So I think a way to think of it, if I may, Andrew, is our top steps. Our top steps are a little bit lower, and our longevity is kind of industry standard relative to coming into 15 years. That's what it is in Bow, Hopkinton, and Wyndham. No, I take that back. Wyndham actually comes in at year 10 also. So, and nobody in our group, Bedford is the only one that waits until year 20 in our peer group. So 15 is about the sweet spot, and our amounts are a little bit higher, but our salaries are a little bit lower.
So it's pretty much on par is the takeaway there, right?
That's
Yes,
right.
there are some towns with various plans, but okay.
And if you look at the failed agreement, the increase of longevity was much higher than $90. It was, I think, $1,000. And so part of the cost savings is saying we overreached on the amount that the taxpayers could support relative to longevity. And so we backed off on that, but we also increased the COLA. So that's got an offset. It's not a one-to-one offset, but it does have an offset.
Another
Are you-
question?
Please proceed.
Okay. Sensitive to time here as well. The
We're ahead of schedule.
the sick days that I was reading in this agreement. Help me understand, there's 125 sick days, and then 110 sick days depending upon your tenure. Is that also industry norm? I mean, to me, it just sounds like, whoa, that's a lot, right? And if somebody's out, then you're likely talking disability. You know what I mean? So
Right.
help me understand how real these numbers are, how often that they're used. And I also understand and reflect upon the conversation that Mr. Bork had mentioned about, these are teachers, right? They're susceptible to kids with germs, right? And they get sick faster and likely longer. right? So I'm balancing that as well. But to me, 125 days and 110 days, I'm like, geez, I don't get that. I don't think anybody gets that, right? And so I'm just trying to balance, is that norm or is that something unique to our district?
So I don't have that by our peer group. It's something I could easily pull out of their collective bargaining in terms of what they can accumulate. But I will tell you, the 3 districts that I've been in, that's the norm. So the same number is there. And it runs the gamut. There are teachers who build up to that cap. They never take a sick day. They build up to that cap. And that's just the nature of their immune systems and the way they operate. And there are other teachers who utilize the time that is provided because they're sick, somebody in the family's sick, whatever. With FMLA leave now, it's changed the nature of the use of that time. And so all of that comes into play. But
Is this an active negotiation point when you have contract discussions? Is the number of sick days that are granted?
Absolutely. You'll see in here that there's a change that occurred not with this agreement, but the previous agreement that reduced the sick days from 12 to 10. So it was an attempt to issue fewer sick days. They can still build those up to the 110 days, right? Down from the 125. But again, that's all. It was an attempt to get a lower number. And many teachers, especially as they approach retirement, because the non-use of the days factor into a separation payment. So there's other clauses in the contract. So you wouldn't want to just, okay, it's my last year, I'm going to take all 110 sick days now.
That's where I'm going with this,
It's
right?
more,
No,
it's like
because there's a
deferred
clause that
compensation.
allows them to, there's a purchase out piece at the end that can help them. And so there's really no incentive to utilizing the time unless you're legitimately sick. And frankly, our short-term disability plans come into play after they've used up their time. So that is their short-term disability plan because they utilize the time that they've banked. So if somebody were to come down with an awful disease, that's their ability to be paid as part of that.
And then the final question,
Go ahead.
the actual court approval, right? This is a whole new process for me. I can't remember in the many years that I've been a part of following these meetings that we've gone through this, right? So what is the process in terms of the court approving the special meeting?
Yep.
When do you expect that to occur? And would it be before or after this tentative August 5th special meeting that the budget committee would hold to vote?
So you're asking me to predict what a court's going to do on a busy docket with judges who are going to take vacation in July and August, right? So
Where's your April?
those are the factors that we have to play with. But what the attorney has said is that the August 9th deadline that has been asked of the budget committee to have a vote, right? He would hope that there would have been a hearing by then, but there may not be. It could be delayed. He said it runs the gamut. He's seen cases where a judge will have a full hearing, listen to all the parties, take time to make decisions on it. And other times a judge will look at it and say, this is fine, let him have the meeting. Because ultimately all he's saying is let the voters decide. It's okay for the voters to decide whether they want to approve this or not. So some judges can very easily just say, sure, not a problem. And others will say, convince me why. So that's a question mark that we have. It all depends on the docket and exactly who is hearing the case, right? And either way, what our attorney has said is that the budget committee doesn't have to wait for the actual approval. That you can make a recommendation on this. And in fact, that could be something that is helpful to a judge. It can add to the case to say, the budget committee of 9 people have voted 9-0 that this is imperative that the voters be able to vote on it, right? And so then a judge looks at it and says, well, here's a municipal budget committee that has said this is something that would be helpful. So that can also be come into play on it. So
I guess where I'm going, I mean, we just heard, the first hour and a half of today's meeting, right? And special meetings and then kind of the process that goes through that and how they can be very difficult, right? And so it would seem to me that it's prudent of the budget committee to wait until we have a court approval to vote, right? Because we don't know if that'll ever happen or not, right? Is this a whole moot discussion? I don't know,
Why
So
would we wait?
the attorney has said that it's not moot.
If the court doesn't approve it, right, and it says, no, Litchfield can't have this special meeting, then all of this is null. Right? We don't get to vote because the court has already denied the town from having a special meeting to approve this.
So what's the downside for the budget committee?
The downside for the budget committee is we need to understand whether the court approves, right? To understand the fact that this, yes, we're going to go forward to the voters
That would change your vote.
for tax evasion. I don't know, right? It's something for me to
Just,
consider.
to me, it's a vote. It's, we're not bending over backwards or anything. We're taking a vote that may help the case, may not.
I would think we would vote based on the merit of the agreement, not whether or not the court sees it qualifies as special or an emergency. I mean, that's what we heard tonight, right? So I feel like that's a separate process. I feel like we have an obligation to vote, and it doesn't, to me, it doesn't matter if it's before or it's after, but I feel like we have an obligation to vote.
So if we vote and the court denies it, would this then go forward to the March warrant? Or would a different agreement go forward?
So I believe, I asked that question once, and I think I'm accurate in saying that the parties have to sit down and renegotiate, but they're not sitting down and renegotiating in a vacuum. They're renegotiating from a renegotiated agreement that got held up on a procedural legal matter. I think the negotiations would be relatively well framed out at that point, and then you would go through the regular process with deliberative at January and then the vote in March. So the answer is, I guess the parties could sit down and say, are we just good bringing this one forward? And if everybody is, then that's the process we would follow. They could say, nope, now we want to tweak and adjust it again, and it would be a renegotiation.
I think you'd have to, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily go retroactive, or I guess you could, but.
No, it would
You
not
would
be.
have
No, it
gone-
would,
3 year.
Right, but it would by definition change, right? Because the 2019, 2020 increase would be zeroed out, and then you'd have to
correct.
shift
And
it to 2022, 2023.
the first year of sticking with green would be over, right? So you'd be saying, are we ready to shift to yellow
Okay.
next year as we originally planned? So there would be some renegotiation relative to kind of housekeeping stuff.
And like to clarify for Andrew's question, the school board vote and the budget committee vote, if we both voted, those votes, if it wasn't done, would be null. They'd just disappear, and both boards would have to vote again, correct?
It would be
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
to me, it just seems this vote would be, obviously it's an important vote, but if it would help the case, I would think we'd want to do it. If, again, depending on how we vote, but I think we'd want to vote to help the case. And I guess there's also the question if, depending on how the vote came out, then there's other decisions to make too.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, we're assuming that this committee is going to vote. I don't know how everybody's going to vote, but what if it doesn't go in your favor?
I would argue.
I'm speculating.
No, yeah,
And it could hurt you as well.
absolutely. There's
I
a
would argue
million.
it's important for us to know that, I would think, before we went in also. If we're hoping for 9-0, but if the vote was 4-5, I think me as a school board member, I'd want to know that before we sent it to the state, because I don't know, we'd have to talk at that point.
That's it for questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else?
Good question.
Well, as I stated before, our bylaws prevent us from voting tonight, and there's been a lot of information provided, so I appreciate that. Good questions. So I think I've reached out to everybody on this committee. I've heard back from almost everybody. So I would make a motion that we have hold a follow-up meetings, but I don't know if it constitutes special meeting, but a scheduling meeting for Monday, August 5th, 7:00 here, to take up a vote on this recommendation.
Second.
All right, so then
Is there any way we can do 7:30?
I'm happy to go later. It doesn't matter to me. Earlier, I have a trouble with.
We can vote the date of August 5th.
Well,
We can iron out the time.
I will work the logistics. Okay, so I will amend my motion. You can to say
And my second.
August 5th, time to TBD, no earlier than 7. All right.
Does it conflict with select board?
No, it doesn't. That's the day they don't have a meeting. So,
Now I resecond.
all right. All right, so the motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of holding a meeting on August 5th to address this issue, please say aye and indicate by raising your hand. Aye. Those opposed and abstaining. So then the motion carries. It sounds unanimous to all who's here. All right, so then
Excellent.
we'll
Thank
meet
you.
on August 5th.
And so inevitably, a lot of information. You get a question, reach out to me.
Well, to me through you.
There
to
you
you
go.
through me.
There you go. So I apologize. This isn't my board, is
Well,
it?
no, it's just a matter of this way we can funnel it all and make sure all the questions get
And if I'm
tracked.
not available because of vacation and you need a quick answer on something, Corey is the guy behind the numbers. So running it by him would be appropriate too. All right.
But typically what I will do is get me and then I'll CC him and then you and I'll just CC Corey as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me make a note of that because I'll forget if I don't write it down. So,
Have a good night.
yes, thank you very much. All right. I do forget if I don't write it down, so it has to be done. All right. So now, headed back into the regular order, we were going to talk about town business. So do we have anything we need to talk about real quick? Because we can slide on by.
If anybody's been living under a rock, it's been a couple lively meetings, but
Yeah, have that.
but no, I mean, we bought a couple of new lawnmowers, so the grass will get mowed.
That has budgetary impact. The other stuff, you
Yeah,
know.
it was money already on hand, so, and we traded in a tractor, so. But other than that, that's about the most excitement.
Well, you can keep the rest of the excitement to yourselves.
Ain't that the truth?
All right, so that moves into the school. General updates.
The fence is almost done. Middle school. They've started the front entrance at the high school. Everything's going well there. And we're just waiting for final numbers next month. I believe we have the final numbers for year end. So one more payroll. Yeah. Your questions on encumbrances or?
There was the
There's
business,
a list of them.
the business administrator's report had a list and it was of proposals. So were there any questions? We did want to have an idea and discussion about, or at least go over them quickly. Were there anything that jumped out? I mean, there was a big truck.
Let me just summarize,
There
right?
you
So
go.
we have 197,593 that was board approved encumbrances.
Yes.
Checking on the number, right? Okay, so looks like some electrical work at CHS for 2,600. An egress at CHS for 9,936. We have the respray of the track for 26,500
Mhm.
at CHS. We have dark room ventilation for 13,000 at CHS. CHS conversion of access control,
I had a question about that one
13,971.
because did we not in recent years spend money to convert to key card swipes and would that work not
I
have
believe
already
it's
been
an-
done?
I believe it's an updated key card swipe that's going in with the replacement of the vestibule.
Okay.
To offer, I think these are better controlled, better access control. I think it's in line with the other two schools, if I'm not mistaken.
That just stinks because we spent a lot of money not too long ago. That's why we need a 5-year plan. So,
We'll talk about that after.
Yeah.
I think that's coming up, right? So let me just finish the summary here. Grounds truck for the district, 29,800. We have replacement of corridor unit number 11 at GMS for 11,860. Replacement of preschool ramps also at GMS for 18,840. A playground shed, GMS for 2,894. GMS intercom system for 13,838. 7th grade wing exterior door replacement at LMS for 12,876. Clock replacement, LMS 3,600. LMS intercom system, 13,378. And LMS heating repairs for $24,500.
it's just, some of that stuff just, and for me, it's frustrating in that we spent money to update the phones. Why didn't we do the telecom at the same time? You know, we spent, we looked at a lot of this stuff. This is the short-term planning costs us more in the long term. It just kills me. So
I think these are intercoms, not phones.
we were there running the wires. You could have,
And I think this is.
Same wires now.
it's the same.
Magic 8 ball must have been broken.
I think the intercoms, I'd have to double check and get back. I think all the intercoms are Homeland Security from their walkthrough.
For me, these encumbrances, they seem to make sense in our general maintenance and repairs for the most part. So I have no comments.
Nothing crazy. I saw that they pulled the front entrance up at LMS, so I'm hoping that we we'll discuss that at some point, but I was glad to not see it there as an encumbrance. So are there?
General updates relative to the school. Shout out to the Raise Craze dollars for GMS, right? I saw work actually being done at GMS for site clearing for a new swing set. So I know for those of us that were part of the playground committee, right, work is starting to commence. So good news there as well.
That is exciting. My sons drive by and they're like, when is it going in? So it's exciting. Anything else for that? Oh, and then how are your enrollments looking? Is it still on target for?
Still on target. We're talking, we're getting up there with kindergarten again. I think it was 69. We're up to 69, 72 is the cutoff. So we're starting to talk about adding the fifth teacher, which we budgeted for this year.
Still space issues though, so good luck solving that one.
He's, Ms. Thompson's already planning with that. She's proactively planning for that, but I think we're gonna have to make a decision at the 15th meeting next month.
Okay.
It's getting really close.
So if you're waiting on doing it, please submit your paperwork so they get their numbers. So, all right, anything else on the school that we see? All right, so then we'll move into the new business, which would be the budget committee participation on the capital planning committee. So that committee has already
They
started.
met just once as a planning meeting.
Yep, and so we sent the paperwork out or the information in the last meeting, I believe, to look at and discuss. And this is the opportunity to bring together a plan, long-term plan. Now, am I correct in this, that it's also in conjunction with the town also? Or no? Or is there a town representative on it? There is.
Yeah, Schaefer's
All
on
right, yeah, so at least it's not operating in a vacuum. That's excellent. Something I've long advocated for. So,
So what's the budget committee's position on this particular committee? What's our role?
we were gonna ask, like, did they want advisory? Was it a voting? Like, what
It
exactly?
would be a voting member of the committee.
And how would that impact a vote here was our concern.
Would that be any different than the two
Well,
of us sitting here?
but when you're here voting, you've already voted as a committee and are representing the view of your committee. If we have these meetings, how do we know how this committee would view and represent?
But
and
when I'm
vote?
voting for selectmen's items and he's voting for school board items, but Brian and I have talked about it, I wasn't elected, but I have an equal voice for selectmen item. He has an equal voice for school board. I would think it'd be the same thing in reverse I would think. It'd be the same, just in reverse for.
I guess it would be up to the committee.
Most likely.
Is that a position you're
Makes sense.
comfortable with?
So you're on this committee already.
I had been in the past. I'm not currently because they re-upped it. So I was on it before it expired. Yes.
They've reformed.
Yes, they
They've
reformed.
reformed, it's a new committee, new charter.
Yep.
So the people that were listed on the thing that we got in May that's not accurate anymore.
I don't believe so. I know I have not been contacted directly. I served as a community member in the past because the budget committee did not elect to have a representative.
I don't have them anymore.
As of right now, it's Mike, Corey, building administration, school board member, and a selectmen's member.
Right.
And they're asking us to join. And community input will come through town hall.
So the question then comes, like, how does this committee view? In the past, we have not typically sent a member to these committees, but we're a different board, different committee.
Yeah, and I would just say, we heard it today, right? The independence of the committee that was said first and foremost by the municipal association. This is part of that independence where you have independent vote. If you're part of a committee recommending dollars to the budget committee to vote, that's the concern, right? So
I think it would depend if the, sorry. I mean, when we talked about this last time, I didn't feel like it was the role of I think it muddies the waters. If you are acting as a member of the budget committee, because then you are representing the budget committee. And I don't feel comfortable asking any one of us to represent all of us in a forum like that. I think it's lovely that they asked us, but I just don't think it's a good idea for us to.
I think it's important to know what they're thinking, but I don't think it's necessarily we want to bring our voice to that committee. I think we want to know what they're thinking and what the plan is.
So what if as
Right,
a non-voting member?
So what if it's an
It's-
ex officio, right? So you
Yeah.
use a thing where you have a non-voting right, but you participate in the meetings and the sessions, they'll work with it, where you can.
But I'd even say how I feel sometimes, like, no offense, you guys in the vicinity, I don't feel comfortable voting for the chair.
Right.
I abstain from the vote just because I'm not an elected member, and I do feel some things are for the elected members. I just went on the fifth slide, with your proposal, request information, I just think you and committee would be perfect to bring concerns, to relate, to be that conduit between the capital planning committee and this board, so that there's no surprises come October when we go through budgets. And, if the person, if the word is not to show, it might be fine if the person chose not to vote on certain things until they get input from the committee. And I'd imagine, just like me, I don't necessarily agree with everything the school board does, but I have to vote when the school board
Right.
votes. I would imagine we'd be okay maybe before votes for that member to come back here and lay things out, or take the direction.
And that's where I think everything just gets really muddy. Like, I would rather we get a regular update from what they're doing, so we have an idea as to what's happening. Again, I think one of us representing all of us on another committee, voting or otherwise, I think it complicates things. And I think this board has very different opinions on a lot of things. So, what Carrie would bring to that and what I would bring could be very similar in some ways and very different in other ways, and not necessarily reflective of all of these opinions. I think it's problematic. I would not be in favor of it.
Oh, see, I'm torn though. I enjoyed it. I felt like I had a lot to contribute, but I have no avenue in which to do it. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I actually almost feel like I should abstain
But not as
because,
a budget committee member. I don't think it's appropriate.
no, absolutely, I hear you. And that's the part that kills me is that the way it's set up is there's no other opportunity for people to weigh in. But, I don't know. So is there a motion?
I'll make a
Sure.
motion. How should I put it? Make a motion to a budget committee member participate in capital planning committee.
Made and seconded. Any other input?
This motion, you're saying as a full voting member.
Well, I think right now we can participate and then
Well,
figure out the extent to
I would
which.
still make the argument for the person to abstain from vote, so I'd say if a member is requested.
See, I almost feel like I should abstain from vote because I want to be on the committee, but don't want to be on it I don't feel the budget committee member should be it. It's not a conflict here. As a capacity as a budget committee member, I don't know that I feel that it's appropriate without votes representing, if a person, the intent of the position is to represent the budget committee, then they have to be able to represent the budget committee, which means there have to be votes beforehand to bring to the table. I mean, darn it. So, all right. So with all those in favor of a budget committee member being nominated to the capital planning committee, please now signify by saying aye and raising a hand. All those in favor? Aye. Oh, I'm sorry. All those please indicate aye. Those opposed? Aye.
Aye.
Those abstain? All right. Unfortunately, the motion fails.
Was that 270?
So we look forward to hearing your updates, Rob. So I guess that ends that one. Any other new business or input that they'd like to bring forward?
Well, I just was wondering if, I know a couple of us had been with the Board of Selectmen on the Highway Tour, and then when I watched the Board of Selectmen's meeting this past week, Chairman Weber had discussed potentially inviting the Budget Committee to tours of future facilities, and I just wasn't sure what other people on the board felt about that, or it was literally just like looking and being able to see the things that we're voting on. I found it really helpful.
Absolutely. Again, we've done that in years past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Ask for a little bit more notice.
Well, yeah.
Yes, can somebody provide a summary of that walkthrough? I didn't hear anything about the walkthrough.
So I know Matt before was there with the camera, so that.
Is that posted on YouTube?
It will be shortly.
Okay, that's why I haven't seen it. Got it.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll look for that.
That might be the easiest.
I'll ask Chairman Weber for a schedule also, if he has at least a potential timeline, what he's thinking. So like you said, we can plan a little further in advance.
So is the idea that these walkthroughs are going to lead to projects which we're going to see on future warrant articles? Is that kind of
That
the
was
philosophy?
the undercurrent that I sense.
I mean, that's the hazard with any kind of interaction with any.
I guess my question is not seeing the meeting yet, right? Is there significant reason to be concerned with the highway department that's going to justify significant expense to improve the facility?
I think it was a bringing an awareness of where the facility is right now, where our current assets are and what those needs may be, and whether that means trading in assets to more accurately reflect our needs or making purchases and changes and things they might be doing policy-wise. But from a perspective of this is what, as a budget committee, our obligation is to provide a budget that meets their needs, right? And so going there and seeing where the facility is and where it stands helps us to be able to actually view the need in the field. And so it'll be an opportunity to look at other buildings and facilities within town so that we can understand what requests are coming forward, why they're coming forward, what needs are they're trying to address. I mean, you're not obligated to vote yes or no for the request, but at least to be in the mindset of understanding where that request originated.
And just to be clear, I mean, no, just to be clear, I mean, there wasn't a quorum, there was no business discussed or
Right.
anything like that. It was-
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
I did have one other thing.
Please proceed.
I don't know if I was gonna jump in under correspondence, but I didn't know if it fit there. But I know there was a question about some of the overspends and the lines on the insurance.
That's right, Troy.
And so what had come back was that, and I think this relates to an old policy the Board of Selectmen had, where they have this gentleman's agreement with the library trustee.
Yes.
So,
There's a memorandum of understanding that the Board of Selectmen, with an old Board of Selectmen, that I think one of them remains and nobody.
Can you just refresh us where we are with this?
So what happened was, Nikki pointed out that the health insurance and dental for the town administrator is over budget by a bit. And what happened was when the library trustees changed the definition of full-time, somebody then became eligible as a result of a life change. And so they needed somewhere to book that charge. And so they charged it against that account. The understanding is that they may not have been eligible without the change in the status, which we discussed here and opted not to fund. But there was an agreement between an old Board of Selectmen and the library trustees that the Board of Selectmen would cover overages and healthcare expenses because they don't have a large budget from which to draw reserves. Not all the Board of Selectmen were aware of this memorandum of understanding, and my understanding is that there may be more discussion forthcoming. But that's where the current status is and why it's so far over is because there was an unanticipated expense at the library.
Thank you.
All right. All right, did I miss anything else? Because it could happen. No? All right. So that would then open us up to public input. So if you'd like to come forward, please come on up. You're the next contestant.
I have an update. So the power of texting. I checked in with the association and they said there was strong support. So that is the update for the budget committee. Strong support by the teachers for the agreement. Thank you.
Any other members of the public would like to come? Absolutely. Just come on down, state your name and address for the wonderful secretary.
Thank you. Tara Hirschberger, Natticook Ave, and I'm on the school board. And I just wanted to share a story with you regarding the negotiations of the school with the LEA, because just to show you how each side has given up something. And I mean, many things. We went back and forth. I've lost track how many times, but each side gave something. And in the end, and I'm not going to say which side it was, but one of us gave a proposal, and on it, final proposal, because we went back and forth. And we ended up going back and forth 3 more times after that. We didn't want to give up. None of us wanted to give up. We wanted to make sure that there was a contract ready and available for our teachers. They really deserve it. And, we don't want to lose good teachers. We have a great school system, and I really hope you support the contract. Thank you. I know.
Anybody else? Absolutely welcome. Come on down.
Hello, my name is Margaret Norton. I live on Woodhawk Way. I'm also here to do whatever I can to let you all know how important it is for you to approve that teacher's contract. Having children in the school system for the past 14 years and being involved in numerous ways through the parents organization. I don't know how many of you have had kids involved or what your involvement was, but our teachers are amazing. I speak with people, my friends that have kids in other districts. The connection's not the same. We have teachers that have been here so long who stay, who know they've been making less money because they love this town, but more importantly, they love our kids. I ask you to approve it because by not approving it, we're not supporting our teachers. And I really feel through the last handful of years that they don't feel our support. And when I say our support, I'm talking the school board, the budget committee, the town. And we've lost a lot of really good teachers because of the contract that the town people did not approve. And I would hate to see what would happen if we can't get this to go through. Bottom line is the ones we're hurting are our kids, and it's heartbreaking. So if I'm able to, am I able to have other parents who couldn't be here send you emails?
Yep, our email address is budcom@litchfieldnh.gov, or you can send it to me, kdouglas@litchfieldnh.gov. I'm also on, you'll see me on Facebook. You can private message me.
I hate Facebook.
That's all I'm available by email.
Email will do better. But I mean,
Sure we're gonna have Matt report, put it up the little address right below, budcom@litchfieldnh. I will share it. That's right. You're right. So go directly to email. So we
Email?
don't have any issues with 91A. So yes, please stick to email.
okay. But I really hope you can all, at the next meeting, vote to approve it because it means so much to our teachers, but really more to our kids. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to come forward? Absolutely. Come on down.
Janine Ankdahl, Tanager Way. I'm a parent in the district as well as a teacher in the district. And Andrew asked a little bit about morale. And I'll say that I feel like morale is fairly low right now. I feel like getting Dr. Jetty at the helm is helping, and that's great. We're making progress, but we're not teaching in Litchfield because we hope someday to earn as much as all the neighboring towns. We're not hoping we're going to have the best insurance. We work in Litchfield because we do love these families. And we have the connections because we have great families here and we have a lot of devoted teachers. And when we did not get the support of the budget committee for, your numbers people and, 89%, 80% and the little nitty gritties, it also took a hit to the morale to the teachers when we did not get that support of the initial contract that the negotiating teams had worked so hard to agree on. So it was an awful lot of work for the negotiating teams who thought they were signing up for a job this big and ended up getting a job this big to come back with another tentative agreement. And I'm just hoping we can get support of the budget committee now because I know it's the voters who ultimately decide, and the voters have a hard decision of, how much they can afford in their taxes. And I know they're not saying they're against schools if they can't afford something that comes through on the ballot. But when they see what the budget committee has decided, I think that affects their perception. So it is important to us and for our morale that we get the support we can. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Travis Tucker. I'm a junior at Campbell, and I live at 13 Garden Drive. So as a student at Campbell, I've been very blessed to learn from some of the kindest and smartest people that I know. What we saw in March was definitely very heartbreaking to so many of us. As a student, I've never felt so helpless, knowing that so many of the most crucial individuals in my education from kindergarten and preschool all the way till now may not be around next year. I remember sitting in my honors chemistry class and hearing kids ask, "Are you coming back next year?" Hearing those conversations just hurts, knowing that these individuals who I see every day that I talk to couldn't come back, whether it's because of reasons in the school, for their health care, or with their pay. I it's also scary to imagine some of the enthusiasm that we have at Campbell. In Litchfield, we are blessed to have such a great spirit, such a great community, and our schools, especially at Campbell, at LMS, at GMS, we're a community, we're a family, and it's definitely scary to imagine that that could go away. I'm also scared that when I apply to college, I'll fall short in recommendations because none of my teachers will know me. I know many of us are scared that when we walk across the stage at graduation, we'll look into the audience and see none of the faces that have played guiding roles in our education. I think it should be alarming to all of us that so many of our teachers are leaving the district. This should tell us that something isn't right. The fact that we have music teachers that have been here since 2005, that we have English teachers leaving, math teachers all across, support staff. It's alarming and it's very scary. I think we need to do everything we can to support our educators at all three of our schools and preserve the legacy. Teachers leaving affects all of us as students. It affects our mental health. It affects our relationships. It affects our education, and it also can affect our scores. We live in an above average community. We have above average school systems, and I think it's important to preserve that. And we have so many teachers that work so hard, and I think we need to show them that it really matters. I ask that the board looks favorably upon the contract because we need to do all we can before it's too late. It's so important. I think this constitutes an emergency. The fact that we have so many teachers that are leaving because they're getting denied what they can get in every other town in New Hampshire. As a student in 2019, we have so much to worry about, from grades, sports, music, our friends, and I think we shouldn't have to worry about our teachers. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So anybody want to try to follow that one up?
Well stated. Good job.
Yes, very good. All right. Well, is somebody making a move for this front? Because I'm about to close it. All right. So I appreciate everybody's input. I think we've covered everything on the meeting minutes. So unless there's a motion to.
So moved.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Second. All those in favor, please say aye. Or raise your hand. Aye. Opposed? And abstain. Excellent.
I saw Bob's hand go up for opposed.
All right. So